In the quiet stretch of southwestern Vermont, the Green Mountains break into long ridgelines where forest and shadow blend so completely that even familiar trails can seem to disappear under shifting weather and dense canopy. Over time, this landscape has been crossed by hikers, hunters, and search parties moving through the same corridors of terrain, yet scattered across different years are moments where someone entered these woods and was never seen leaving them within what later became known as the Bennington Triangle. No single explanation connects the incidents, and no consistent pattern was ever confirmed in full, only fragments preserved in reports, testimony, and the edges of official investigations. For you, what follows is not a retelling of legend, but a reconstruction of documented disappearances and the environments they unfolded in, how each case moved from ordinary circumstances into uncertainty, and why these particular mountains continue to resist closure in the historical record. A wilderness that earned a dark reputation. There are places where the landscape feels ordinary until history begins to gather around it, and then there are places where the land itself seems to have acquired a reputation long before anyone tried to explain it. In the far southwestern corner of Vermont, the forests rise into a maze of ridges, valleys, and mountains that have changed remarkably little over the past 2 centuries, preserving an isolation that can still be felt despite modern roads lying only a short distance away. Travellers often describe the region as beautiful, yet beauty alone has never explained why so many stories linger there, why generations have spoken of certain trails with hesitation, or why one section of these mountains gradually became known for mysteries that refused to disappear. Before anyone attached a memorable name to this stretch of wilderness, before newspaper headlines carried stories of people who seemingly vanished without explanation, the land had already begun collecting whispers that suggested it was different from the forests surrounding it. The region now associated with the Bennington Triangle lies within Vermont's Green Mountains, a chain that stretches north and south through much of the state. While Vermont is often imagined as a landscape of peaceful villages, covered bridges and rolling hills, its mountainous interior tells a different story, particularly where dense hardwood forests cover steep terrain that can quickly become difficult to navigate. Around Glastonbury Mountain, the landscape is defined by thick woodland, narrow valleys, rocky outcrops, wetlands, and streams that shift with the seasons, creating an environment where visibility is limited even during daylight. In autumn, fallen leaves can conceal uneven ground and forgotten paths, while winter blankets the mountains in snow that erases tracks almost as quickly as they appear. Long before search and rescue technology existed, these natural conditions ensured that anyone who became lost could disappear from sight with alarming speed. Although the phrase Bennington Triangle is now recognised far beyond Vermont, it is a surprisingly recent creation compared to the history of the land itself. The term was popularised by author and folklorist Joseph A. Citro during the late 20th century as a way to describe a cluster of unexplained disappearances and unusual stories centred around Glastonbury Mountain and the surrounding communities. Drawing inspiration from the widely known concept of the Bermuda Triangle, Citro used the name not to define an officially recognised geographic boundary, but to describe a region where an unusual number of mysteries appear to overlap. Different writers have outlined the triangle's borders somewhat differently, yet most place its points near the towns of Bennington, Woodford, Shaftesbury and Somerset, with Glastonbury Mountain occupying the unsettling heart of the area. What makes this region distinctive is not merely its size but its character. Unlike wilderness preserved solely for recreation, much of this landscape reflects centuries of changing human activity layered upon older natural features. Old logging roads disappear into forests that have reclaimed them. Stone walls emerge unexpectedly beneath moss, and abandoned cellar holes mark places where homes once stood before nature quietly erased nearly every visible trace of the people who lived there. A hiker can walk for hours through these mountains while passing evidence that others once believed this wilderness could be settled permanently, only to discover that almost everything they built has gradually been swallowed by trees. That sense of isolation has existed far longer than the modern legend. Before European settlement transformed Vermont, the region was known to indigenous peoples, including the Western Abenaki, whose communities lived throughout parts of what is now Vermont and neighbouring areas. Historians and anthropologists caution that many dramatic stories later attached to native traditions cannot be reliably traced to documented indigenous sources and over time local folklore has often blended authentic cultural history with speculation. Still, there are documented accounts suggesting that certain mountainous areas were regarded with caution, valued more as places to travel through than places to inhabit permanently. Mountain weather could change rapidly. Dense forests concealed dangerous terrain, and unfamiliar travellers faced risks that required no supernatural explanation. As the 19th century progressed, settlers arrived with ambitions very different from those of the people who had known the mountains before them. Vermont's forests promised timber, its hills contained mineral resources, and isolated valleys appeared suitable for small communities that could support industries tied to the surrounding wilderness. Roads were cut through forests, rail lines eventually reached remote settlements, and towns that had once seemed impossible to establish suddenly appeared among the mountains. Yet even during periods of growth, life in these higher elevations remained unusually demanding. Long winters isolated communities for months. Transportation could become impossible after heavy snowfall, and economic survival depended upon industries vulnerable to changing markets and depleted resources. Geography amplified every challenge. Glastonbury Mountain rises to more than 3,700 feet above sea level, but its height alone is not what makes it formidable. The slopes are intersected by ravines, uneven ridgelines, dense spruce and hardwood forests, and areas where visibility narrows to only a few yards. Weather arriving from surrounding valleys can shift rapidly, replacing clear skies with fog or snow in remarkably little time. Even experienced hikers have remarked that the forest often feels larger than maps suggest because natural landmarks repeat themselves, making orientation surprisingly difficult. Before satellite navigation, remaining on the correct route depended heavily upon familiarity with the terrain, careful observation, and favourable conditions that were not always guaranteed. Natural obstacles alone, however, rarely create enduring legends. Stories survive because people continue repeating them, and over generations this region accumulated accounts that seemed unusual even by the standards of rural New England. Hunters described stretches of forest where wildlife appeared unexpectedly scarce. Some reported moments of unnatural silence after birdsong abruptly ceased, while others claimed that familiar trails somehow became confusing despite years of experience. Such accounts cannot be verified as objective phenomena, nor do they appear consistently across documented sources, yet they became recurring elements of local storytelling because they echoed a common impression that certain parts of the mountain felt strangely different from neighbouring forests. Adding to the atmosphere was the remarkable absence of permanent settlement across portions of the mountain itself. Unlike many regions where towns steadily expanded into surrounding countryside, several communities near Glastonbury struggled against geography and economics until they ultimately declined. As buildings were abandoned and roads deteriorated, the wilderness reclaimed increasingly large sections of land. Empty clearings returned to forest, foundations collapsed beneath vegetation, and familiar landmarks disappeared from memory. The result was a landscape where evidence of former human activity survived only in fragments, making it easy for later visitors to imagine that entire communities had simply faded into the woods. The Green Mountains have always inspired contrasting impressions depending upon who entered them. Artists, hikers, and conservationists have praised their quiet beauty, describing forests rich with wildlife, brilliant autumn foliage, and an enduring sense of solitude increasingly rare in the northeastern United States. At the same time, loggers, hunters, and residents familiar with the terrain often viewed the same wilderness through a more practical lens, recognizing that dense forests could become dangerous within minutes if weather deteriorated or a person strayed from established routes. These differing perspectives did not contradict one another. Instead, they revealed how beauty and danger could coexist so completely that separating one from the other became nearly impossible. By the early 20th century, stories surrounding the region had begun spreading beyond nearby communities. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned unusual incidents occurring in the mountains, while conversations passed from one generation to the next, gradually transformed isolated anecdotes into something resembling regional folklore. Most accounts remained impossible to verify, and many almost certainly became exaggerated with retelling, yet they contributed to an emerging belief that the mountains possessed an unusually persistent ability to conceal whatever entered them. In an era before national media amplified local mysteries, These stories circulated primarily through residents who knew the forest personally, rather than through sensational headlines. It is important to distinguish carefully between folklore and documented history, because the reputation of the Bennington Triangle rests upon both. The mountain was not regarded as mysterious solely because of supernatural tales, nor did every unexplained story originate from verified events. Instead, legend grew alongside reality, each influencing how later generations interpreted the other. When people disappear in an area already associated with strange stories, coincidence becomes harder to separate from expectation, and ordinary uncertainties can acquire extraordinary significance. The wilderness itself does not explain why such interpretations arise, but it provides the setting in which they become remarkably difficult to dismiss. Modern visitors often arrive searching for evidence of the paranormal, expecting hidden portals, mysterious lights, or creatures lurking beyond the trees because popular culture has attached those ideas to the Bennington Triangle. Yet the landscape offers something subtler, and in many ways, more unsettling. It reveals a wilderness capable of swallowing roads, reclaiming abandoned homes, confusing experienced travellers, and preserving unanswered questions for decades without requiring any dramatic explanation at all. The forests remain quiet not because they reveal nothing, but because they reveal only fragments, leaving every observer to decide whether those fragments point toward coincidence, nature, or something that has yet to be understood. By the time the name Bennington Triangle entered American folklore, the foundations of its reputation had already been laid through generations of isolation, abandoned settlements, demanding geography, and stories passed carefully from one voice to another. The disappearances that would later define the legend did not emerge from an empty stage. They unfolded within a landscape where uncertainty had become part of its identity, and where every unanswered question seemed to deepen the silence rather than disturb it. Hidden among those forests was a community whose rise and disappearance would become inseparable from the mystery itself. The town that slowly disappeared. Beneath layers of leaf litter and towering hardwoods, faint traces of forgotten streets still hint that an entire community once stood where silence now settles over the mountain. The casual visitor may notice little more than uneven ground, a line of weathered stones, or an embankment that appears too straight to be natural, but each of those details marks the outline of lives that once unfolded deep within Vermont's Green Mountains. Nothing about these remnants announces itself loudly, and that restraint is precisely what makes them so unsettling. Unlike the ruins of castles or abandoned factories, there are no towering walls left to command attention, only subtle fragments waiting to be recognized by those willing to look closely. Hidden beneath the forest is the story of a town that did not vanish overnight through disaster or violence, but instead slipped away so gradually that the wilderness eventually became its most faithful historian. Only after examining those scattered remains does the name Glastonbury begin to emerge from Vermont's historical records, revealing that this quiet wilderness was once an incorporated town with ambitious beginnings. The town was chartered on August 20th, 1761, by New Hampshire Governor Benning Wentworth during a period when large portions of what is now Vermont were being divided into new townships. Like many of the grants issued during that era, Glastonbury existed on paper long before it became a thriving settlement. Its mountainous terrain discouraged rapid development, and while lower valleys elsewhere attracted farmers with fertile land, Glastonbury offered far fewer advantages for agriculture. The steep slopes, rocky soil, and long winters demanded persistence from anyone willing to establish a permanent home, ensuring that settlement advanced more slowly than the optimistic language contained in its original charter might have suggested. Drawn by forests that seemed almost limitless, settlers and investors saw opportunity in timber long before the mountain acquired its darker reputation. During the 19th century, Vermont's timber industry expanded rapidly, and Glastonbury's dense stands of spruce, hemlock, maple, and beech represented valuable natural resources waiting to be harvested. Logging camps appeared throughout the surrounding mountains, while sawmills converted enormous trees into lumber that supplied growing communities elsewhere in New England. The forests also supported charcoal production, an important industry during a period when charcoal remained essential for iron manufacturing. Although farming never became the town's economic foundation, The woods themselves provided a livelihood capable of attracting workers who understood that prosperity depended less on clearing the land than on carefully exploiting what already grew upon it. For a brief span of the 19th century, daily life unfolded here with the ordinary rhythm of work, family and commerce despite the settlement's remarkable isolation. Historical records show that Glastonbury contained homes, schools, a post office, and businesses serving the needs of residents whose lives revolved around the surrounding forests. Children attended classes while adults laboured in logging operations or related industries, and supplies reached the community along rough mountain roads that demanded patience during every season. Like countless other small New England towns, Glastonbury developed a routine that balanced hard physical work with the practical necessities of rural life. There was nothing inherently mysterious about the community itself. It existed because people believed the mountain could support them, and for a time that belief appeared entirely justified. The arrival of the railroad strengthened that confidence by connecting this isolated settlement more directly with distant markets. During the late 19th century, rail lines associated with the lumber industry extended into the area, allowing timber to be transported far more efficiently than wagons travelling over steep mountain roads. Railroads transformed many remote communities across northern New England by making industries economically viable that otherwise would have struggled against geography. For Glastonbury, the tracks represented more than transportation. They symbolised permanence. Investments in rail infrastructure suggested that the surrounding forest would continue producing wealth for years to come, encouraging both businesses and workers to imagine a stable future in a place that had previously seemed too remote for sustained growth. Every passing winter reminded the people of Glastonbury that the same mountains providing their livelihood could just as easily cut them off from the outside world. Snow accumulated deeply across higher elevations, making already difficult roads nearly impassable, while freezing temperatures complicated travel, communication, and the delivery of supplies. Even outside the winter months, heavy rain could wash out sections of road or transform narrow mountain routes into hazardous passages. Residents accepted these hardships because isolation was part of life in many rural Vermont communities during the 19th century. Yet Glastonbury's location amplified nearly every challenge. Unlike towns situated beside major rivers or fertile valleys, it relied upon an economy tied almost entirely to natural resources, whose availability could never be guaranteed indefinitely. As nearby forests gradually yielded fewer valuable resources, the promise that had sustained the community began slipping away one business and one family at a time. Logging had always depended upon abundant timber, and once the most accessible stands had been harvested, maintaining profitable operations became increasingly difficult. Companies looked elsewhere for fresh resources, while workers followed employment opportunities beyond the mountains. Economic decline in Glastonbury reflected a broader pattern experienced by numerous resource-dependent communities throughout North America, where prosperity often lasted only as long as the industries supporting it remained profitable. There was no single moment when the town collapsed. Instead, each departure quietly reduced the population until absence became more noticeable than activity. Changing economic conditions accelerated the decline. As transportation networks improved elsewhere and industries modernized, isolated mountain settlements found themselves competing against locations offering easier access to labor, markets, and infrastructure. Maintaining businesses in Glastonbury required overcoming logistical difficulties that became increasingly difficult to justify financially. Families who had spent years building lives in the mountains gradually relocated to communities where employment appeared more stable and daily life demanded fewer sacrifices. Their decisions were practical rather than dramatic, yet together they transformed the future of the town far more decisively than any natural disaster could have done. By the opening years of the 20th century, the signs of decline had become impossible to ignore as homes emptied and familiar voices steadily disappeared from the valley. Census figures reflected a shrinking population, while institutions that once served local residents struggled to remain active. Businesses closed, buildings fell into disrepair, and roads received less maintenance as fewer people relied upon them. Eventually, Glastonbury ceased functioning as an active incorporated community in any meaningful sense. Today, it remains one of Vermont's 2 unincorporated towns, administered by the state rather than maintaining the traditional municipal government found elsewhere. That legal status serves as one of the last official reminders that the settlement once occupied a far more prominent place on Vermont's map than its present appearance would ever suggest. Nature required remarkably little time to begin reclaiming what people left behind. Roofs collapsed beneath heavy snow, wooden structures decayed under constant moisture, and abandoned fields gradually surrendered to young trees that matured into dense forests. Stone foundations endured longer than timber buildings, while cellar holes remained visible because they had been carved directly into the landscape itself. Old roadbeds persisted beneath leaves and moss, occasionally revealing their presence through unusually straight embankments or carefully stacked stone walls that no natural process could have created. Modern hikers crossing these mountains often pass within a short distance of such remnants, without recognizing what they represent, unaware that the forest surrounding them once echoed with the ordinary sounds of a working community. Today, careful observers can still find fragments of that vanished settlement, where moss-covered foundations and abandoned roadbeds quietly resist being erased altogether. Archaeological remnants scattered across the area provide tangible evidence that Glastonbury was neither mythical nor imagined despite its modern reputation. Stone walls continue tracing forgotten property lines, while old cellar depressions indicate where families once built homes intended to last for generations. Certain sections of railroad grade remain discernible beneath the trees, offering subtle reminders of the industrial ambition that once reached deep into the mountains. None of these discoveries appear spectacular on their own, yet together they create an unusually powerful impression, because they force visitors to imagine an entire community reconstructed from little more than scattered fragments. History alone cannot explain why deserted places seem to invite stories that outlive the people who first walked their streets. Across cultures and generations, abandoned settlements have repeatedly become settings where folklore flourishes, partly because empty spaces encourage imagination to supply what visible evidence cannot. A forgotten foundation raises questions about the family who built it. An overgrown road suggests destinations that no longer exist. Silence itself becomes meaningful because it replaces sounds that once defined everyday life. Glastonbury's transformation into a ghost town therefore accomplished something beyond historical significance. It created an environment where later mysteries would be interpreted against a backdrop already shaped by absence, memory, and the persistent feeling that the forest had reclaimed more than buildings alone. Long after Glastonbury ceased to function as a town, its empty landscape remained a destination for those whose work regularly carried them deep into the surrounding wilderness. Loggers continued operating in nearby forests, hunters followed game across the mountains, surveyors crossed isolated ridges, and local residents maintained practical familiarity with terrain that outsiders rarely visited. Unlike tourists searching for legends, these men and women entered the wilderness because their livelihoods depended upon understanding it. They measured the landscape through experience rather than folklore, learning where streams crossed old trails, where weather changed unexpectedly, and where travel demanded caution. Their knowledge carried weight precisely because it had been earned over years spent in the mountains rather than inherited through rumour. Among the people who knew those forests best, some quietly learned that there were places on the mountain where experience offered far less confidence than anyone expected. Hunters who refused to enter. Few experienced woodsmen could explain exactly why certain stretches of the mountain inspired hesitation, yet many learned over time that confidence alone was never enough to navigate every corner of the wilderness. Those who spent years hunting game, surveying timber, or working in the forests rarely described the landscape in dramatic terms, because practical people seldom relied on superstition to make decisions that affected their safety. Instead, their caution revealed itself in quieter ways. Certain ridges were crossed only when necessary, some hollows were avoided late in the day, and particular routes gradually fell out of favour despite offering shorter passages through the mountains. None of these habits prove that anything extraordinary existed within the forests surrounding Glastonbury, but they do suggest that the mountain's reputation was shaped not only by stories passed between neighbours, but also by the repeated choices of people who knew the terrain better than almost anyone else. Knowledge of these forests rarely appeared in official records, passing instead through conversations between hunters, loggers, trappers, and local families who spent far more time beneath the trees than most visitors ever would. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, wilderness experience was shared much like any skilled trade. with experienced outdoorsmen teaching younger generations how to recognize weather patterns, locate reliable water sources, follow game trails, and avoid dangerous terrain. The most valuable lessons often had little to do with maps, because maps could never fully describe how a mountain behaved during changing seasons. Instead, knowledge developed through observation accumulated over years of walking the same ridges repeatedly. Local caution therefore tended to survive in memory rather than written documentation, making it difficult for historians to distinguish long-standing traditions from later embellishments. Even so, the consistency with which certain areas were described as unusually difficult or unsettling suggests that these conversations reflected genuine experience, even when the reasons remained impossible to define precisely. Long before modern folklore attached extraordinary claims to the region, the Western Abenaki and other indigenous peoples had already developed generations of practical knowledge about Vermont's mountains, though many stories later attributed to them cannot be verified through historical evidence. The Western Abenaki lived throughout what is now Vermont and neighbouring regions, adapting to a landscape of forests, rivers, wetlands, and changing seasons through detailed environmental knowledge acquired over centuries. Like many indigenous communities across North America, they understood that mountains demanded respect rather than fear, and successful travel depended upon reading the landscape carefully instead of attempting to dominate it. Over time, however, modern retellings of the Bennington Triangle frequently attach dramatic supernatural beliefs to indigenous traditions, without reliable documentation supporting those claims. Historians have repeatedly cautioned against accepting such stories uncritically, because they often originated decades or even centuries after European settlement. Respecting indigenous history therefore requires separating authentic cultural knowledge from legends that emerged much later, even if those later stories contributed to the region's growing reputation. Even on calm mornings, the mountain could produce moments that lingered in memory, as shifting fog, changing winds, and unusual acoustics occasionally transformed familiar trails into places that felt unexpectedly unfamiliar. Anyone who spends enough time in mountainous forests understands how rapidly environmental conditions can change. Valleys may remain bright while ridges disappear beneath low clouds, and a gentle breeze in one location can become complete stillness only a short distance away. Sound behaves differently as well, sometimes carrying conversation surprisingly far while at other moments seeming to vanish altogether among dense stands of trees. These natural phenomena are well understood by meteorologists and outdoor professionals, yet experiencing them firsthand often creates a powerful emotional impression. A familiar trail can suddenly appear unfamiliar when visibility shrinks, landmarks disappear into mist, and ordinary sounds become strangely distorted by the surrounding terrain. Seasoned hunters have always relied as much on the behaviour of wildlife as on maps or landmarks, making every unexplained silence or sudden change in animal movement difficult to ignore. Experienced outdoorsmen constantly observe birds, deer, squirrels, and other animals because their behaviour often reveals subtle environmental changes before people notice them. A sudden absence of birdsong may simply indicate the approach of a predator, while shifting winds can redirect animal movement in ways that make previously active forests seem unexpectedly empty. Similar patterns occur naturally across wilderness areas throughout North America, and no scientific evidence suggests that wildlife around Glastonbury behaves according to unique or unexplained rules. Nevertheless, stories describing unusual quietness became recurring elements of local tradition because hunters remembered those moments vividly. For someone accustomed to forests filled with ordinary sounds, unexpected silence can be profoundly unsettling, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it interrupts patterns that experience has taught them to expect. Reports describing unusual sounds became equally woven into local storytelling. Some accounts mentioned distant knocking noises echoing through the trees, while others described voices seeming to travel from uncertain directions or echoes that made locating their source unexpectedly difficult. Dense forests and uneven mountain terrain naturally influence acoustics, allowing sounds to bounce unpredictably between slopes, especially under particular atmospheric conditions. Similar effects have been documented in mountainous environments around the world, where echoes and temperature inversions alter the way sound travels. Yet people encountering such conditions without understanding the underlying physics often remembered them as distinctly strange experiences. Over generations, ordinary environmental effects gradually became incorporated into the mountain's folklore. not because they defied explanation, but because they occurred often enough to become part of local conversation. Stories involving unreliable compasses gradually became woven into the mountain's reputation, though separating measurable navigation challenges from later embellishment remains far more complicated than many legends suggest. Modern discussions of the Bennington Triangle frequently mention reports of compass needles behaving erratically, sometimes implying that unusual magnetic forces operate beneath the mountain. However, no scientific evidence has demonstrated the existence of persistent magnetic anomalies unique to Glastonbury, capable of producing the dramatic effects often described in popular accounts. Compasses can become unreliable for many practical reasons, including operator error, local mineral deposits, damaged instruments, or misunderstanding of magnetic declination, which varies geographically and requires correction for accurate navigation. In dense forests where visibility is already limited, even small navigational errors can gradually place travellers far from their intended route. The legend of mysterious compasses therefore illustrates how genuine navigational difficulties can become transformed into more extraordinary explanations as stories pass from one generation to another. Practical caution often develops for reasons that outsiders never witness, and over many years certain ridges, hollows, and heavily wooded slopes earned a quiet reputation among people who depended on sound judgment for their safety. Hunters rarely avoid productive ground without reason, since successful hunting often requires travelling through difficult terrain that casual hikers would never consider entering. Yet some experienced outdoorsmen quietly favoured longer routes rather than crossing particular sections of forest, especially when weather conditions were uncertain or daylight was beginning to fade. Such decisions may have reflected steep ravines, confusing topography, dense undergrowth, or simple familiarity with places where navigation became unnecessarily difficult. Whatever the original reasons, repeated acts of caution eventually became traditions in their own right. Younger hunters inherited not only preferred routes, but also the understanding that certain areas demanded greater respect than others, even when no single explanation fully accounted for that advice. By the early decades of the 20th century, the mountain's unsettling reputation no longer belonged solely to abandoned settlements or fading local folklore, but also to the experiences quietly shared among those who worked and hunted there. These conversations rarely reached newspapers because they concerned practical observations rather than sensational events. A logger returning before dusk from one valley instead of another did not make headlines, nor did a hunter choosing to circle around a difficult ridge rather than crossing it directly. Yet collectively, these small decisions reinforced the idea that portions of the wilderness possessed characteristics that deserved unusual caution. Long before the phrase Bennington Triangle existed, local reputation had already begun forming through countless ordinary choices repeated over decades by individuals who valued experience above speculation. When these traditions are viewed alongside the region's demanding geography and documented history, they reveal a pattern of persistent unease that is easier to recognize than it is to explain. None of the stories concerning strange sounds, unusual wildlife behavior, unreliable navigation, or inherited caution provide conclusive evidence that anything beyond the ordinary existed within the mountains. Many have reasonable environmental explanations, while others survive only through oral tradition and cannot be independently verified. Yet dismissing them entirely overlooks an important historical reality. The reputation surrounding Glastonbury did not emerge suddenly after a handful of famous disappearances attracted national attention. Instead, it developed gradually through generations of people whose lives were closely connected to the wilderness, creating a cultural memory that endured even when individual stories faded or changed with retelling. By the time outsiders eventually focused their attention on the mountain, local residents had already spent decades treating parts of it with a level of respect that bordered on quiet apprehension. Then, in the autumn of 1945, the mountain confronted those old warnings with a disappearance that no amount of wilderness experience could prevent. The day Midi Rivers never returned. Autumn arrived in the Green Mountains much as it always had, but November of 1945 would leave behind more than fading leaves and the first hints of winter. Hunting season brought familiar activity back to the forests surrounding Glastonbury, where local residents and visiting sportsmen ventured into country that generations of outdoorsmen had learned to respect. The mountains looked much as they had for decades, their ridges covered with hardwood forest stripped of much of their autumn colour as colder weather settled across southwestern Vermont. Nothing about the season suggested that it would become a turning point in the history of the region. Yet sometime during those ordinary days, the mountain transformed from a place known mainly through local reputation into one associated with a disappearance that investigators would never be able to resolve. For the first time, long-standing stories of caution would be tested against a documented case involving someone whose experience should have made such an outcome extraordinarily unlikely. The man at the centre of those events was Middy Rivers, an experienced hunting guide whose familiarity with the surrounding wilderness made him one of the least likely people anyone expected to lose. Contemporary accounts consistently described Rivers as someone who knew the mountains exceptionally well, having spent years guiding hunters through the forests near Glastonbury. His work depended upon understanding the terrain in practical detail. He would have recognised game trails, natural landmarks, changing weather conditions, and the subtle differences between ridges that appeared almost identical to inexperienced visitors. In a landscape where unfamiliarity often posed the greatest danger, Rivers possessed precisely the kind of knowledge that normally reduced risk rather than increased it. That reputation would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of his disappearance, because every reasonable expectation suggested that if anyone could safely navigate these woods, it would have been him. On November 12, 1945, Rivers was leading a small hunting party through the mountains near Glastonbury in what initially appeared to be another routine day in country he had travelled countless times before. Hunting guides frequently positioned themselves slightly ahead of their clients, both to set the pace and to monitor the route through difficult terrain. The forest during November offered improved visibility compared to the dense foliage of summer, yet the landscape remained physically demanding. Rolling hills, rocky ground, narrow streams, and thick stands of trees interrupted direct travel, requiring constant attention even from experienced outdoorsmen. Nothing in the documented accounts indicates that the group encountered unusually severe weather or any obvious emergency during the outing. The day unfolded with the quiet familiarity expected of countless hunting trips that had taken place in these mountains over many years. Shortly before the group expected to return, Rivers moved ahead along the route, leaving only a brief and seemingly ordinary separation between himself and the hunters following behind. Such moments were common during guided excursions, particularly when an experienced guide wished to scout the trail ahead or maintain steady progress through uneven country. No contemporary report suggests that anyone viewed the separation as unusual at the time. Rivers remained close enough that the others reasonably expected to catch up with him after negotiating the terrain between them. Instead, he passed beyond their immediate view, and within a remarkably short period, certainty ended. The exact location where Rivers was last seen has never been established with complete precision in surviving records, but what is clear is that the distance separating him from the rest of the party was not considered significant enough to cause immediate alarm. At first, there was little reason for concern because experienced guides often walked ahead while navigating familiar terrain, and everyone expected him to appear again within minutes. Those following behind continued along the route believing that Rivers would either pause farther ahead or naturally rejoin the group once the trail became easier to travel. When he failed to appear, the delay likely seemed more inconvenient than alarming. In wilderness travel, brief separations occur regularly without consequence, particularly among individuals accustomed to moving independently through familiar country. Yet as additional minutes passed, ordinary expectations slowly gave way to uncertainty. Calls directed into the surrounding forest produced no response, and the confidence that had accompanied the hunting party throughout the day began to dissolve beneath a growing realization that something was no longer unfolding according to experience. Minutes gradually became something far more unsettling, as repeated calls received no reply, and the surrounding forest offered no obvious indication of where Rivers had gone. The hunters retraced portions of their route, searching for footprints, broken branches, or any sign that their guide had left the expected path. Such evidence would normally be among the first things experienced outdoorsmen noticed, particularly in terrain they already understood. Yet nothing immediately explained his absence. The forest itself remained unchanged. No reports described signs of violence, abandoned equipment, or obvious indications of an accident. Instead, those searching encountered the most frustrating circumstance imaginable in wilderness investigations: the complete absence of information pointing toward a clear direction. A man deeply familiar with the mountain had simply failed to reappear where every practical expectation suggested he should have been. By nightfall, concern had spread well beyond the hunting party, prompting local residents, game wardens, and other volunteers to begin searching ground that should have been familiar to the missing guide himself. Search efforts expanded rapidly as word reached nearby communities, bringing together individuals who understood both the seriousness of the situation and the formidable nature of the surrounding terrain. Organised searches during the mid-1940s depended almost entirely upon human endurance, local knowledge, and systematic coverage of difficult ground. Volunteers walked ridges, examined valleys, and called rivers' name across forests that absorbed sound almost as readily as they concealed movement. Every hour increased the urgency because November temperatures in Vermont could fall rapidly after sunset, exposing anyone stranded outdoors to dangerous conditions even without injury. Over the following days, search teams continued examining the wilderness despite increasingly discouraging results. The mountains surrounding Glastonbury presented countless natural obstacles that complicated every effort. Dense woodland reduced visibility, fallen leaves concealed footprints, and uneven terrain slowed systematic searches that already demanded extraordinary physical effort. Areas appearing relatively small on maps often required hours to examine properly because steep slopes, tangled undergrowth, and rocky outcrops forced searchers to proceed carefully. Rivers' extensive familiarity with the landscape made these difficulties especially perplexing. Searchers were not simply looking for an inexperienced visitor who might have wandered off course. They were searching for someone whose professional life had been built upon avoiding precisely that outcome. Searchers eventually uncovered remarkably little that could explain the disappearance, leaving investigators with only scattered clues and far more unanswered questions than confirmed answers. One frequently repeated detail in later accounts concerns the reported discovery of a single rifle cartridge associated with rivers, though surviving historical sources differ in their descriptions of exactly where it was found and what significance investigators attach to it. Beyond that limited evidence, no verified trail clearly established what had happened after Rivers separated from the hunting party. No confirmed signs indicated that he had suffered a fatal fall, encountered an animal, or intentionally left the area. Without additional evidence, investigators could not confidently support any single explanation. The investigation therefore became defined less by what was discovered than by everything that remained absent. What made this case especially difficult to dismiss was not simply that a man had vanished, but that the man who vanished possessed years of practical knowledge that should have made such an outcome extraordinarily unlikely. Wilderness experience does not eliminate every risk, and history contains numerous examples of skilled outdoorsmen meeting unexpected accidents. Nevertheless, Rivers' familiarity with the mountains naturally influenced how local residents interpreted the case. If an inexperienced hunter had disappeared, many observers might have assumed navigational error or poor judgment. Rivers represented the opposite. His reputation rested upon guiding others safely through terrain that intimidated less experienced visitors. The disappearance therefore challenged assumptions about how well knowledge alone could protect someone in these forests, reinforcing a sense that the mountain still possessed the ability to surprise even those who understood it best. Looking back from the present, it is clear that this disappearance marked a turning point, transforming generations of local unease into a documented mystery that would continue unfolding over the years ahead. At the time, however, no one could have known that Rivers' disappearance would later be regarded as the first major modern case connected with what eventually became known as the Bennington Triangle. Newspapers reported the search, local communities mourned the missing guide, and investigators eventually exhausted every practical lead available to them. Like many unsolved disappearances, the case gradually receded from immediate public attention, yet it never truly disappeared from local memory. Instead, it remained an unanswered question waiting quietly in the background, acquiring greater significance only after later events caused people to look back and recognize unsettling similarities. Before the mountain had time to surrender even one clear answer, another unexplained disappearance would bring far greater public attention to the same unforgiving wilderness. Paula Jean Weldon walked into the trees. Early in December 1946, another ordinary day began in southern Vermont without any indication that it would soon become one of the state's most enduring mysteries. Less than a year had passed since the unexplained disappearance of Midi Rivers, and although that case remained unresolved, daily life across Bennington County continued much as it always had. Winter had begun settling over the Green Mountains, and the forests surrounding Glastonbury stood quieter than they had only weeks before. Students attended classes, local residents followed familiar routines, and hikers continued using portions of the Long Trail, one of the oldest long-distance hiking routes in the United States. Nothing about the opening hours of December 1st suggested that another disappearance was about to draw unprecedented attention to the same region. Yet by the end of the day, concern for one missing person would begin expanding into an investigation unlike anything Vermont had experienced before. Among the students attending Bennington College was 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon, whose quiet routine gave no obvious hint that her name would soon be known far beyond the campus. Weldon had enrolled at the college earlier that year after growing up in Stamford, Connecticut, and those who knew her generally described her as thoughtful and responsible. Contemporary accounts provide no evidence that she intended to disappear voluntarily or that she had discussed plans suggesting she wished to abandon her studies. Like many college students adjusting to a new environment, she spent her time balancing academic responsibilities with ordinary social life. Her disappearance therefore carried an especially unsettling quality, because investigators found no immediately convincing reason to believe she had placed herself knowingly in danger. After leaving the college grounds on the afternoon of December 1st, Weldon set out alone toward a route that many hikers had travelled before her. According to surviving accounts, she was wearing a bright red parka, sneakers and jeans, clothing that later became one of the most recognisable details associated with the investigation. Witnesses reported seeing her accept a ride from a couple, travelling toward the area near the Long Trail where she intended to begin walking. The Long Trail stretches the length of Vermont and has attracted hikers since the early 20th century, passing through forests, mountains and remote sections of the state. By choosing part of this route for an afternoon walk, Weldon was not entering an unknown wilderness, but following a well-established trail used by many outdoor enthusiasts. Even so, portions of the trail quickly pass into rugged country where assistance may be many miles away. Several independent witnesses later described seeing a young woman matching Weldon's appearance as she continued along the Long Trail toward Glastonbury Mountain. Among the most frequently cited accounts was that of an elderly couple who reported seeing her walking confidently along the trail, while another witness believed he had observed her farther ahead as the path entered increasingly wooded terrain. These sightings became critically important because they allowed investigators to reconstruct at least part of her journey with reasonable confidence. At the same time, they also revealed how rapidly certainty could disappear in mountainous country. Each witness extended the known timeline a little farther, yet every confirmed observation only carried investigators to the point where the trail curved into denser forest. Beyond that location, no verified evidence established where Weldon travelled next. Beyond that final confirmed observation, every subsequent step became a matter of uncertainty rather than documented fact. No reliable witness reported seeing Paula leave the mountain, return to the roadway, or encounter any obvious difficulty along the trail. Unlike investigations supported by modern surveillance cameras, mobile phone records, or electronic location data, authorities in 1946 depended almost entirely upon physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. Once those sources ended, investigators were forced to consider numerous possibilities without possessing sufficient information to eliminate most of them. Had she continued deeper into the mountains, turned onto another trail, suffered an accident, or encountered another person? The historical record provides no definitive answer to any of these questions, and that absence of evidence remains one of the defining characteristics of the case. When evening arrived without Paula returning to campus, a routine absence quickly developed into growing concern among those who knew where she'd last been seen. Friends and college officials recognized that something was wrong after she failed to come back as expected, prompting efforts to determine her whereabouts before notifying authorities. As concern spread, investigators began reconstructing her movements from the moment she had left Bennington College earlier that afternoon. Every confirmed sighting became increasingly valuable because each represented one of the last fixed points in a timeline that otherwise contained remarkably little information. The challenge facing investigators was not simply locating a missing student. It was determining where the search should even begin across hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain intersected by trails, roads, streams, and dense forests. As the search widened across the surrounding mountains, hundreds of volunteers, local officials, aircraft, bloodhounds, and members of the National Guard joined one of the largest search efforts Vermont had ever undertaken. Search teams examined miles of woodland, followed streams, climbed ridges, and repeatedly searched sections of the Long Trail where Weldon had last been reported. Bloodhounds attempted to follow her scent, while aircraft surveyed portions of the wilderness from above whenever weather conditions allowed. The search continued despite increasingly difficult winter conditions that complicated both visibility and movement across the mountains. Local residents joined professional searchers, demonstrating the widespread determination to locate some trace of the missing student. Yet despite the extraordinary scale of the operation, the forests surrounding Glastonbury yielded almost nothing capable of explaining what had happened after the final eyewitness sightings. Across the country, newspapers followed the case with increasing interest, as the disappearance evolved from a regional concern into a nationally discussed mystery. The combination of a young college student, a respected educational institution, and an apparently inexplicable disappearance captured public attention far beyond Vermont's borders. National publications reported developments in the investigation, while growing media coverage generated both valuable leads and significant complications. Increased publicity encouraged additional witnesses to come forward, but it also produced rumours, speculation, and unverified claims that investigators were obligated to examine. As public fascination expanded, pressure mounted upon local authorities to solve a case that had rapidly become one of the most closely watched missing person investigations in the country. Investigators soon found themselves navigating conflicting witness accounts, persistent rumours, and countless leads that consumed valuable time without bringing them any closer to definitive answers. Numerous theories circulated regarding Weldon's fate, ranging from accidental death in the wilderness to the possibility of foul play or voluntary disappearance. Historical records show that investigators explored many of these possibilities, yet none produced evidence sufficient to establish a definitive conclusion. One practical difficulty stemmed from Vermont's limited investigative structure at the time. The state did not yet maintain a centralized state police agency capable of coordinating large-scale criminal investigations across multiple jurisdictions. Responsibility instead fell largely upon local officials working alongside other agencies, creating logistical challenges during a search of unprecedented size and complexity. The disappearance also attracted assistance from outside Vermont, reflecting the unusual scale of public concern. Although the Federal Bureau of Investigation provided certain forms of support when requested, its authority in missing person cases remained limited unless evidence indicated a federal crime had occurred. Consequently, investigators often relied upon cooperation between local authorities, volunteers, neighbouring jurisdictions, and other available resources while continuing to pursue an investigation that offered remarkably few concrete clues. As days turned into weeks, the absence of physical evidence increasingly defined the case. No confirmed personal belongings, clothing, or remains were recovered that could conclusively explain what had happened to Paula after she entered the mountains. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the central mystery rather than reducing it. In the years that followed, the disappearance left a legacy extending well beyond the unanswered fate of one college student, prompting lasting changes in how Vermont organized major criminal investigations. Public criticism of the fragmented investigative response encouraged Governor Ernest W. Gibson to support the creation of a statewide law enforcement agency better equipped to handle complex cases crossing local boundaries. In 1947, the Vermont State Police was formally established, representing one of the most significant institutional consequences arising from the investigation into Paula Weldon's disappearance. Although the new organization could not solve her case retrospectively, it reflected a widespread recognition that future investigations required stronger coordination, centralized resources, and clearer authority than Vermont had previously possessed. Few missing person cases have altered the structure of an entire state's law enforcement system so directly, making Weldon's disappearance historically significant even apart from the enduring mystery surrounding her fate. While the mountain still guarded its silence, the next disappearance would unfold far from a woodland trail and challenge investigators in a way no one expected. James Tedford vanished without leaving his seat. The previous disappearances had unfolded deep within the forests and mountains surrounding Glastonbury, where steep ridges, abandoned logging roads, and endless stretches of woodland offered countless places for a person to disappear beyond sight. By the time another case emerged several years later, many residents had come to associate the growing mystery with isolated wilderness, assuming that distance from civilization was the common thread connecting each tragedy. Then a new disappearance challenged that assumption in a way no one expected. This time, the setting was not a lonely trail or a forgotten mountain slope, but the interior of a public bus travelling through southern Vermont, where dozens of ordinary moments unfolded under the watch of fellow passengers, making what allegedly happened next seem almost impossible. The man at the centre of this mystery was James E. Tedford, sometimes spelled Tetford in newspaper accounts, a military veteran who had spent much of his later life living at the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington. The institution provided housing and care for ageing veterans, and Tedford, who was in his 60s, was a familiar resident whose routines rarely attracted much attention. Like many of the men living there, he occasionally travelled to visit relatives, making use of regional bus routes that connected the small towns scattered across southwestern Vermont. Nothing about his final documented journey suggested that it would become one of the most enduring stories associated with what would later be called the Bennington Triangle. Accounts generally placed Tedford's disappearance on December 1st, 1949, although some later retellings offer slightly different dates, reflecting one of several inconsistencies that have become attached to the case over the decades. According to the most widely repeated version, he had been visiting family in the nearby town of St. Albans before boarding a bus bound for Bennington. The route would have carried passengers through communities connected by winding highways, with scheduled stops allowing travellers to board and disembark as the vehicle continued south. It was a routine trip made countless times by ordinary people, and nothing reportedly unusual occurred as the journey began. Several passengers later stated that Tedford was present during the trip and remained seated for much of the journey. Witnesses claimed they had seen him occupying his seat after the bus departed one of its intermediate stops, while some accounts even suggest that he was observed sleeping peacefully as the vehicle continued toward Bennington. Unlike disappearances in remote wilderness, where a person's last known location might depend upon uncertain recollections or scattered evidence, this story rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony from people who believed they had shared the same enclosed space with Tedford until shortly before the bus reached its destination. When the bus finally arrived at the Vermont Soldiers' Home, however, Tedford was reportedly nowhere to be found. His luggage remained inside the vehicle. Personal belongings that he had carried for the journey had apparently been left behind as well. According to later accounts, the bus driver and passengers could not explain when or where he had departed. No one reported seeing him leave through the door during any scheduled stop, and if those recollections were accurate, it seemed to suggest that he had somehow disappeared while the bus was still in motion. That extraordinary claim quickly became the element that separated Tedford's story from almost every other disappearance linked to the Bennington region. A person lost in dense woodland could become disoriented, injured, or concealed by difficult terrain. A hunter might wander into an isolated ravine beyond the reach of searchers. A hiker could succumb to exposure before rescuers ever reached the area. Those possibilities, while tragic, belong to the harsh realities of wilderness travel. A man vanishing from a crowded bus without anyone noticing represented an entirely different kind of mystery, one that appeared to remove even the landscape itself from the equation. Yet the more closely historians and researchers have examined the Tedford case, the more complicated it becomes. Unlike the disappearances of Midi Rivers, Paula Weldon, Paul Jepson, or Frida Langer, official documentation surrounding James Tedford is surprisingly limited. Much of what is widely repeated today traces back not to contemporary police reports, but to books, magazine articles, and later compilations of unexplained mysteries that often relied on earlier secondary sources rather than original investigative records. As the Bennington Triangle legend expanded during the second half of the 20th century, Tedford's disappearance became one of its most frequently cited examples, even though many details remain difficult to verify independently. One source of uncertainty concerns the witnesses themselves. Later retellings often describe 14 passengers who supposedly confirmed Tedford remained aboard until the bus approached Bennington, but surviving contemporary documentation offering those precise statements has proven difficult to locate. Likewise, descriptions of exactly where passengers boarded, where they exited, and how carefully they observed Tedford during the journey vary from one account to another. Human memory, especially when reconstructed after an unexpected event, is rarely perfect. Small differences in recollection can become amplified over time, particularly after a case acquires a reputation for mystery. The route itself also raises practical questions. Regional buses in Vermont during the late 1940s made multiple scheduled stops, allowing passengers to enter and leave along the way. If Tedford quietly exited at one of those locations while fellow travellers were distracted, it is conceivable that few people would have noticed immediately. Bus passengers are often occupied by conversations, reading, looking through windows, or preparing their own belongings before reaching their destinations. The assumption that everyone continuously monitored one another throughout the journey may not reflect how people actually behave during routine travel. Even so, supporters of the mystery argue that Tedford's luggage complicates such an explanation. If he intentionally left the bus before arriving in Bennington, why would he abandon his possessions? Travellers generally collect their belongings before stepping off public transportation, particularly when returning home after visiting relatives. Leaving luggage behind might suggest confusion, haste, or some unexpected interruption. Yet without reliable contemporary investigative records describing exactly what remained on the bus, even this frequently repeated detail cannot be examined with complete certainty. The absence of definitive evidence has encouraged countless theories. Some writers have suggested that Tedford suffered a medical emergency before quietly leaving the bus in a confused state, only to encounter misfortune elsewhere. Others have speculated that he voluntarily disappeared for reasons unknown, beginning a new life beyond Vermont. More imaginative interpretations have ventured far beyond available evidence, proposing supernatural forces, dimensional anomalies, or unexplained phenomena capable of removing someone from an ordinary setting without warning. These ideas, however, rest entirely upon speculation rather than documented fact. What remains historically significant is not simply whether Tedford disappeared exactly as later stories describe, but how his case reshaped public perception of the larger mystery. Earlier disappearances had encouraged people to fear the forest surrounding Glastonbury Mountain. Tedford's story suggested something different, that whatever connected these cases might not be confined to remote trails or abandoned settlements. If someone could allegedly vanish from a moving bus filled with witnesses, then the mystery seemed capable of following people beyond the boundaries of the wilderness itself. That shift in perception helped transform separate disappearances into something resembling a unified legend. Instead of viewing each case as an isolated tragedy with its own unique circumstances, many began searching for patterns linking them together. The geographic area surrounding Bennington acquired an increasingly mysterious reputation, while individual disappearances that may once have stood alone became chapters in a larger narrative. The name Bennington Triangle, introduced years later by author Joseph A. Citro, would eventually provide a memorable label for those connections, encouraging future generations to examine the cases as parts of a single enduring puzzle. Researchers who approach the subject cautiously often emphasize an important distinction between legend and evidence. Legends grow through repetition, especially when they combine compelling stories with unanswered questions. Each retelling tends to preserve the most dramatic elements, while quietly losing the uncertainties surrounding original sources. Over time, details repeated often enough can begin to feel unquestionably true, even when historians cannot fully reconstruct how those details first entered the story. The Tedford case illustrates that process remarkably well, existing at the crossroads where documented history gradually blends into regional folklore. Whether James Tedford truly vanished under the extraordinary circumstances described in later accounts may never be resolved with complete confidence. The available evidence leaves room for skepticism, but it also leaves enough unanswered questions to prevent the story from fading entirely. There is no confirmed explanation identifying where he went, why he was never found, or precisely what occurred during that final journey toward Bennington. In that absence of certainty, the disappearance continues to occupy a unique place within the larger history of the Bennington Triangle, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it demonstrates how easily an ordinary journey can become inseparable from an extraordinary legend. And before the decade was over, the mystery would become even more heartbreaking when it centered on someone far too young to understand the danger surrounding him. the child who was only moments away. By the autumn of 1950, the unanswered questions surrounding Bennington had already begun to linger over the region, but nothing had prepared local families for a mystery that would unfold in little more than a handful of ordinary minutes. Earlier disappearances had already unsettled southwestern Vermont, leaving investigators and residents alike wondering how experienced outdoorsmen and ordinary travellers could simply vanish without explanation. Yet those cases still allowed people to believe that age, distance, or unfamiliar surroundings might somehow have played a role. The next disappearance stripped away much of that reassurance. It involved a child who had not ventured deep into the wilderness alone, who had not embarked on a long journey, and who had been within sight of adults only moments before he was gone. Decades later, the extraordinary speed with which an ordinary afternoon transformed into one of the state's most enduring missing person cases remains one of the most difficult aspects of the Bennington Triangle to fully comprehend. On October 12, 1950, what began as a routine afternoon near Bennington offered no hint that it would become one of Vermont's most enduring missing person cases. 8-year-old Paul Jepson had accompanied his mother to a property where she was completing farm work, an outing that reportedly involved caring for pigs while Paul remained nearby. The location lay close to the wooded foothills associated with Glastonbury Mountain, where farmland gradually gave way to thicker forest and uneven terrain. It was an environment familiar to local residents, neither remote enough to inspire immediate alarm nor crowded enough to make constant supervision effortless. Nothing about the day's routine suggested that it would soon become inseparable from the growing mystery already surrounding the region. Accounts of what happened next have remained remarkably consistent in their broad outline despite the passage of more than 70 years. According to contemporary reports and later historical summaries, Paul's mother left him unattended for only a brief period while she carried out her work nearby. The interruption lasted only minutes, not hours, and when she returned to where she expected him to be, he had disappeared. There was no confirmed witness who saw him walk away, no documented account of him calling for help, and no immediate indication that he had deliberately wandered into the surrounding woods. In an instant, an ordinary family errand became an emergency whose consequences would extend far beyond that October afternoon. At first, everyone nearby assumed the missing boy had wandered only a short distance from where he had last been seen. That expectation was entirely reasonable. Children often become distracted by something interesting, following a path, an animal, or a familiar landmark before realizing they have gone farther than intended. Family members searched the immediate area while calling his name, believing he would soon answer from behind a stand of trees or emerge from the nearby fields. As those first frantic minutes passed without any response, however, confidence steadily gave way to concern. The search radius widened almost instinctively as neighbours joined the effort, each expecting to be the one who found the boy only a little farther ahead. Soon afterward, the search spread well beyond the immediate area as volunteers, police officers, and trained personnel pushed into the surrounding countryside. Local authorities organised increasingly methodical efforts as more people arrived to help, recognising that every passing hour reduced the likelihood of finding Paul quickly if he had become injured or lost. Roads, open fields, wooded slopes, and nearby properties were examined repeatedly, while searchers attempted to reconstruct every possibility that might explain where an 8-year-old could have gone in such a remarkably short period of time. The growing scale of the response reflected not only the urgency of the situation, but also the bewilderment shared by those participating. The known facts seemed too simple to produce such an enormous mystery. Among the limited clues reported during those first critical hours, one detail has remained especially difficult for researchers to interpret. Contemporary and later accounts frequently state that tracking dogs were brought to the area in an effort to follow Paul's scent, and many versions of the story claim the dogs traced it toward a nearby roadway before apparently losing it. Exactly where that scent trail ended has been described somewhat differently across various retellings, and surviving documentation does not always agree on the precise sequence of events. Nevertheless, the reported loss of the trail became one of the most discussed elements of the case, because it introduced possibilities that investigators could neither confirm nor completely dismiss. If the dog's reported behaviour accurately reflected Paul's movements, it raised questions about whether he had continued on foot beyond that point, or whether some other circumstance had interrupted the trail altogether. Equally troubling was the realization that the child should have been remarkably easy to spot if he had remained anywhere within sight of the searchers. Numerous accounts describe Paul as wearing a bright red jacket on the day he disappeared, a detail repeated so often that it has become inseparable from the case itself. In the autumn landscape of southern Vermont, where muted shades of brown, green and fading yellow dominated the countryside, such clothing should have offered a noticeable point of contrast, particularly as more volunteers joined the search. Yet despite repeated efforts to examine the surrounding area, no confirmed trace of the jacket, or of Paul himself, was found during those initial searches. Whether every reported detail concerning his clothing can be independently verified today is difficult to determine, but the persistent absence of any physical evidence only deepened the mystery confronting investigators. Speculation inevitably followed the lack of immediate answers, although officials were careful not to treat unverified claims as established fact. Some observers suggested that Paul may simply have wandered farther than anyone initially believed possible, becoming hidden by the uneven landscape before searchers could reach him. Others wondered whether he might have encountered an unknown individual travelling through the area, though no evidence emerged that conclusively supported such a scenario. Over time, additional theories appeared as the Bennington Triangle legend grew in popularity, with some writers attempting to connect Paul's disappearance to folklore and supernatural explanations that developed years later. Yet the historical record itself remains far more restrained. What can be documented with confidence is that a child vanished within an extraordinarily brief span of time, that a substantial search followed, and that no verified explanation ever accounted for where he went. Beyond the unanswered questions of the investigation itself, this disappearance left a lasting mark on the communities that had followed every stage of the search. Earlier cases had already generated concern, but the disappearance of an 8-year-old transformed that concern into something far more personal. Parents throughout the region could imagine themselves in the Jepson family's position far more easily than they could identify with experienced hunters or adults travelling alone. Everyday routines that had once seemed harmless suddenly appeared more fragile, particularly in communities where children often accompanied their parents during farm work, outdoor chores, or walks through familiar countryside. The mystery no longer belonged solely to isolated mountain trails or experienced outdoorsmen. It had entered ordinary family life, making the uncertainty surrounding Glastonbury feel closer to home than ever before. Even after the initial search ended without success, the disappearance of Paul Jepson refused to fade into the background as just another unresolved missing person case. Investigators continued examining the information available to them, revisiting witness statements and considering the few documented clues that had emerged during those first critical hours. Yet the greatest obstacle remained the same one they had faced from the beginning. There was almost nothing concrete to follow. No confirmed trail extended beyond the area where Paul had last been seen. No verified sightings placed him elsewhere later that day, and no physical evidence emerged to establish what direction he had taken. Every possible explanation depended upon assumptions that could never be tested against definitive proof. The passage of time only emphasized how unusual the timeline appeared. Unlike cases in which investigators gradually pieced together a person's movements over several hours or days, the known sequence of events surrounding Paul Jepson was compressed into an exceptionally brief window. One moment he was accounted for, remaining near the area where his mother was working, and only minutes later he could no longer be found despite immediate efforts to locate him. That narrow gap has remained central to every serious examination of the case because it limits the number of events that could reasonably have occurred, while simultaneously offering too little evidence to determine which, if any, actually did. As newspapers reported the disappearance, the story spread beyond Bennington and drew wider public attention to a pattern that many people had only begun to recognise. Earlier disappearances in the region had already generated concern, but another unexplained case occurring within a relatively short span of years encouraged both journalists and residents to ask whether the events shared something more than geography. At the time, no one referred to the area as the Bennington Triangle. That name would not be coined until decades later, but the accumulation of unresolved disappearances was already shaping local perception. Each new case seemed to cast the earlier ones in a different light, encouraging people to revisit questions that had never been fully answered. That growing sense of unease also influenced the way Paul's disappearance was remembered in later years. Modern retellings often present his case alongside those of Middy Rivers, Paula Weldon, James Tedford and Frida Langer, creating a sequence of events that appears almost inevitable when viewed in hindsight. Yet for those living through October 1950, there was no established legend to explain what had happened. There were only anxious families, searching volunteers, and investigators confronting another disappearance that resisted ordinary explanation. Understanding that distinction is important because it reminds us that the mystery developed gradually, one unresolved case at a time, rather than emerging fully formed as a piece of regional folklore. Researchers examining the historical record have also noted the challenge of separating contemporary reporting from details that entered the story much later. Certain descriptions of Paul's personality, his familiarity with the outdoors, and even specific investigative details have been repeated so frequently that they sometimes appear more certain than surviving documentation actually allows. One commonly repeated claim, for example, is that Paul had an unusual fascination with the outdoors and enjoyed pretending to be a cowboy, while another suggests that his father believed he might have wandered after following a mountain path. Such accounts have become part of the broader narrative, but not every detail can be traced to equally reliable contemporary sources. As with several other disappearances associated with the Bennington Triangle, the passage of decades has encouraged later retellings to blend documented facts with recollections and regional storytelling. None of those uncertainties, however, diminish the emotional weight of the case itself. What continues to distinguish Paul Jepson's disappearance is not the number of theories it has inspired, but the simplicity of the circumstances that preceded it. There was no dangerous expedition, no severe storm, and no lengthy journey into unfamiliar country. The available evidence begins with a child accompanying his mother during an ordinary afternoon, and ends only minutes later with a search that could not explain where he had gone. The absence of dramatic warning has become one of the most haunting aspects of the story, because it suggests that life changed irrevocably without offering anyone a chance to intervene. For historians, the case represents more than an isolated tragedy. It illustrates how quickly uncertainty can become embedded within the history of a place, particularly when multiple disappearances occur within the same region and none receive definitive resolution. Every unanswered question surrounding Paul Jepson reinforced the growing reputation of the mountains and valleys surrounding Bennington, not because investigators concluded that the cases were connected, but because no investigation could fully explain why they continued to happen. The landscape itself began to acquire a reputation shaped as much by absence as by evidence, with each unresolved disappearance strengthening the impression that something about the region remained stubbornly beyond understanding. Today, Paul Jepson's disappearance remains one of the most emotionally haunting cases connected with the Bennington Triangle, because its greatest mystery begins with how little time there was for anything to happen. More than 7 decades have passed since that October afternoon, and advances in search techniques, historical research, and renewed public interest have not changed the fundamental reality of the case. No verified trace has ever established where he went after those final confirmed moments, and no single theory accounts for every documented fact without leaving significant questions unresolved. His story continues to endure not because it offers extraordinary evidence, but because it demonstrates how the briefest interruption to an ordinary day can leave behind a mystery that survives for generations. 5 years later, another seemingly uneventful outing into these mountains would leave investigators confronting an even more perplexing sequence of events. Frida Langer vanished during an ordinary walk. Another autumn passed before the mountains demanded attention once again, this time through a disappearance that seemed destined to end with a straightforward reunion rather than another enduring mystery. The earlier cases had already left investigators and local communities with difficult questions, yet there remained a quiet confidence that not every missing person would share the same fate. People became separated on hiking trails, lost their bearings in unfamiliar terrain, or delayed their return for reasons that only became clear once they were found. The next disappearance initially appeared to fit that familiar pattern. There was every reason to believe that the missing hiker would soon walk back into view, bringing an anxious day to an ordinary conclusion. Instead, what followed would become one of the most perplexing investigations ever associated with the region, not because the missing person was never found, but because finding her ultimately answered almost nothing. Late in October 1950, Frida Langer joined members of her family for a day outdoors near Somerset, where the changing season offered little reason to expect anything beyond an ordinary hike. Frida, who was 53 years old, had travelled from her home in Stamford, Connecticut to visit relatives staying at a family camp in the mountains of southern Vermont. The landscape surrounding Somerset had long attracted hunters, hikers, and visitors seeking the quiet beauty of the Green Mountains during autumn, when cooler temperatures and changing leaves transformed the forests into one of New England's most recognisable seasonal landscapes. For those familiar with the area, spending a day exploring nearby trails and woodland paths was an entirely ordinary activity, and nothing about that October morning suggested it would become the setting for one of Vermont's most enduring mysteries. On October 28th, Frida and her cousin, Herbert Elsner, set out together on a walk through the surrounding forest after spending time with other family members. Contemporary accounts describe the pair following a route that crossed uneven ground where streams and rocky sections interrupted otherwise manageable terrain. Both were accustomed to being outdoors, and there is little to suggest that either regarded the excursion as especially difficult or dangerous. Unlike someone venturing alone into unfamiliar wilderness, Frida was accompanied by a close relative who remained with her for nearly the entire outing. Their walk unfolded as countless others had before it, making the events that followed seem all the more unexpected. Everything began to unravel after an incident so minor that no one present could have imagined it would mark the final confirmed moments before she disappeared. At some point during the hike, Frida reportedly slipped while crossing a stream, leaving her clothes wet but otherwise causing no serious injury. Rather than continuing in damp clothing, she decided to return to the family camp to change before rejoining the others. Herbert Elsner remained on the trail, expecting that Frida would simply take the shorter route back, change into dry clothes, and meet the rest of the group later without difficulty. It was a practical decision that reflected ordinary judgment rather than urgency, and neither of them appears to have believed they were separating under dangerous circumstances. Waiting gradually turned into concern as the expected sound of approaching footsteps never came from the trail ahead. At first, there was little reason to panic. Frida may have needed additional time to return to camp, or she could have paused along the way after slipping in the stream. As the afternoon progressed, however, it became increasingly clear that something had interrupted what should have been a simple return journey. Family members confirmed that she had never arrived at the camp to change her clothing, eliminating the explanation that everyone had initially assumed was the most likely. The route between the stream and the camp was neither especially long nor unfamiliar, making her failure to appear increasingly difficult to explain. Relatives soon retraced the path she was believed to have taken, searching the trail and nearby sections of woodland in the hope that she had become temporarily disoriented or suffered an injury that prevented her from continuing. The first hours of any missing person case often carry the greatest optimism because investigators and family members alike expect that the missing individual remains relatively close to the last confirmed location. In Frida's case, that expectation appeared entirely reasonable. She'd not vanished during a lengthy expedition into remote wilderness, nor had she intentionally separated herself from everyone around her for an extended period. She'd simply set out alone to return to camp following what should have been a familiar route through country that others in her group already knew well. Before long, the surrounding wilderness filled with searchers whose numbers reflected the growing belief that something had gone terribly wrong. Local authorities organised an increasingly extensive response as volunteers from nearby communities joined the effort, recognising that the disappearance no longer resembled a simple delay. Hundreds of people eventually participated in the search over the weeks that followed, making it one of the largest missing person operations Vermont had experienced up to that time. Officers, local residents, and trained personnel worked together in the hope that persistence would succeed where the first hurried searches had failed. The sheer scale of the response reflected how seriously investigators regarded the situation, and how unusual it seemed for someone to vanish under circumstances that had appeared so ordinary only hours earlier. Unlike the earlier disappearances linked to the Bennington area, this investigation unfolded with an unusual degree of determination from the very beginning, because investigators believed there was still a realistic possibility of finding Frida alive. Every day that passed without results increased the urgency rather than diminishing it, as searchers returned repeatedly to areas they believed deserved another look. The confidence that the case would eventually be resolved remained remarkably strong during those early stages, supported by the assumption that a missing hiker would almost certainly leave behind some trace of her movements. Yet despite the growing number of people involved and the sustained effort devoted to locating her, the mountains continued to withhold the answer everyone expected to find. As October gave way to November, the determination that had driven those first days of searching was increasingly tested by the passage of time. Each unsuccessful effort forced investigators to reconsider possibilities that had seemed unlikely at the beginning of the case, while family members continued hoping that some overlooked clue would finally reveal where Frida had gone after leaving the stream. The disappearance had begun with a route so short that it seemed almost impossible for someone to vanish along it without leaving evidence. Yet the days accumulated without producing the breakthrough everyone expected. What had first appeared to be a temporary delay was gradually becoming another unsolved mystery, in a region where too many similar questions had already gone unanswered. Winter eventually brought an unavoidable change to the search. Snowfall, colder temperatures, and increasingly difficult conditions made sustained operations far more challenging than they had been during the final days of October. Although interest in the case never disappeared, the practical realities of searching mountainous terrain through the winter months forced authorities to scale back the effort. For Frida's family, however, the passing seasons offered little comfort. The absence of answers meant there was no certainty about what had happened after she turned back toward camp, leaving every possibility suspended between hope and acceptance. More than 6 months later, on May 12, 1951, the investigation took an unexpected turn that immediately distinguished Frida Langer's case from the other disappearances associated with the Bennington area. Her remains were discovered near the eastern branch of the Somerset Reservoir by her cousin, Herbert Elsner, the same relative who had been hiking with her on the day she disappeared. The discovery finally brought an end to months of uncertainty over whether Frida would ever be found, yet it also introduced a new and deeply unsettling question. According to contemporary reports and later historical accounts, the location where her body was recovered had been included within the area searched extensively during the original investigation. That single detail has remained at the centre of discussion surrounding Frida's disappearance ever since. Searchers involved in the operation believed they had examined the vicinity repeatedly while she was still missing, making the later discovery difficult to reconcile with their earlier efforts. The apparent contradiction has encouraged decades of speculation, but historians generally urge caution when evaluating later retellings. Search operations, particularly those conducted across large sections of rugged wilderness, are rarely capable of examining every square foot with absolute certainty. Dense vegetation, uneven ground, changing weather, fallen leaves, snowfall, and the natural progression of the seasons can dramatically alter what searchers are able to observe from one visit to the next. Even a thorough search cannot guarantee that every location has been viewed from every possible angle under every set of conditions. For that reason, investigators have never reached a definitive conclusion explaining why Frida's remains were not located sooner. Some researchers have suggested that environmental conditions may have concealed them during the initial searches before later changes in the landscape made the area more accessible or visible in the spring. Others have questioned whether the search coverage was as complete as later accounts sometimes imply, noting that memories of large investigations can become simplified over time, particularly after a case acquires legendary status. What has never emerged is any verified evidence demonstrating exactly where Frida spent the months between her disappearance and the recovery of her remains. The historical record establishes when she vanished and where she was eventually found, but the events connecting those 2 points remain unknown. Unlike several of the earlier disappearances, Frida's case did allow investigators to recover the missing person, yet that recovery did not provide the clarity everyone had expected. The available evidence could not establish with certainty how she died, precisely where she travelled after leaving the stream, or why months of searching failed to locate her sooner. Instead of bringing the investigation to a satisfying conclusion, the discovery shifted the mystery into a different form. The question was no longer simply where Frida had gone, but why the answers remained so incomplete even after she had finally been found. In that respect, her disappearance became one of the most enduring examples of how resolving one uncertainty can sometimes create several others. As another unanswered case settled into the region's history, people gradually began to wonder whether these disappearances belonged to a larger story than anyone had first imagined: the mystery of the missing fifth victim. With another unexplained case now part of the region's history, attention slowly began to shift from individual disappearances to the unsettling possibility that they might be connected. For years, each investigation had stood largely on its own, shaped by different people, different circumstances, and different pieces of evidence that rarely pointed toward a single conclusion. Yet as the list of unresolved cases continued to grow, it became increasingly difficult for residents, journalists, and later researchers to ignore the similarities that seemed to emerge whenever the stories were placed side by side. The question was no longer limited to what had happened to one missing person. It was becoming a broader search for a pattern that might explain why so many mysteries appeared to converge within the same corner of southwestern Vermont. Examining those cases side by side reveals why so many observers became convinced they might share something more than geography. Between 1945 and 1950, Middy Rivers, Paula Weldon, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer all disappeared under circumstances that resisted straightforward explanation, although the details of each case differed considerably. Some vanished while travelling through the wilderness, others disappeared near roads or from public transportation, and one was eventually found months after the search had begun. Despite those differences, the relatively short period in which the cases occurred and their association with the mountains surrounding Glastonbury encouraged many people to view them as chapters of a larger mystery rather than unrelated investigations. That perception would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of what is now known as the Bennington Triangle. Surprisingly, one of the most persistent debates begins not with an explanation, but with a number. Popular accounts frequently describe the Bennington Triangle as the site of 5 mysterious disappearances, presenting that figure as though it were an established historical fact. At first glance, the total appears straightforward enough, especially because the names of Middy Rivers, Paula Weldon, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer are now so closely associated with the legend. Yet the certainty implied by that familiar list begins to fade once researchers examine how the story has been told over time. The Bennington Triangle was not identified as a distinct mystery, while these disappearances were unfolding, and no official investigation ever grouped them together as parts of a single case. The idea developed gradually, shaped by later writers who recognized similarities that earlier investigators could not yet have seen. Trace the story through different books, documentaries, and historical summaries, and the list of disappearances rarely remains identical for long. Some accounts focus exclusively on the 5 names most commonly associated with the Bennington Triangle, while others expand the timeline by including incidents that occurred before or after the period between 1945 and 1950. A few writers place greater emphasis on geographical proximity, arguing that any unexplained disappearance connected with Glastonbury Mountain deserves consideration. Others adopt stricter standards, limiting the discussion to cases that share a narrower combination of dates, locations, and circumstances. These differences do not necessarily reflect errors so much as they illustrate the difficulty of imposing precise boundaries on a legend that was assembled retrospectively rather than defined from the beginning. Carl Herrick is the name that appears most frequently whenever researchers attempt to expand or reconsider that familiar list. On November 12, 1943, Herrick, who was 74 years old, disappeared while hunting with his cousin, Henry, in the woods near Glastonbury. According to contemporary reports, the two men became separated while tracking game, and when Carl failed to return, a search was organised to locate him. His body was eventually discovered several days later, and reports from the time indicated that he had apparently suffered injuries consistent with a fall into a ravine. Although the circumstances were tragic, investigators did recover him, distinguishing his case from several of the later disappearances that remained unresolved. Even so, the combination of wilderness, sudden separation, and the location of the incident has led many later writers to view his story as an early precursor to the mysteries that would follow. Not everyone agrees that Carl Herrick should be counted alongside the more familiar disappearances, and the reasons are rooted in the historical record rather than simple disagreement over numbers. Unlike Paula Weldon or James Tedford, Carl's disappearance did not remain permanently unsolved, and investigators reached a practical conclusion that an accident was the most likely explanation for his death. While questions have occasionally been raised about details reported during the search, there is no broad historical consensus that his case belongs to the same category as those in which the missing person either vanished permanently or was recovered under unusually puzzling circumstances. For that reason, historians often present Carl Herrick as a case that influenced later discussions of the Bennington Triangle, without treating his inclusion as universally accepted. Other proposed additions have received far less agreement, illustrating just how difficult it can be to draw firm boundaries around an evolving legend. Over the decades, articles, books, television programs, and online discussions have occasionally attached additional disappearances, accidents, or unexplained deaths to the Bennington Triangle simply because they occurred somewhere within the broader region, or seem to echo elements of the better-known cases. In many instances, however, the available documentation is too limited to establish meaningful connections beyond geography alone. Some incidents took place years outside the period most commonly associated with the legend, while others involved circumstances that differed substantially from the disappearances that first drew public attention. As a result, the farther researchers move beyond the 5 most frequently cited cases, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish documented historical relationships from associations created through later storytelling. This uncertainty reflects an important characteristic shared by many enduring mysteries. Once a series of unusual events becomes recognized as a single phenomenon, people naturally begin looking backward and forward in time for additional examples that appear to fit the same pattern. Cases that might once have been remembered only within local communities gradually become woven into a larger narrative, especially when they contain familiar elements such as an unexpected disappearance, a remote landscape, or a lack of definitive answers. The process does not necessarily require anyone to invent new events. Instead, it often depends upon selecting which documented events deserve to be viewed together, a decision that can vary from one writer to another without altering the underlying historical facts. Everything changed once these separate investigations became associated with a single name that encouraged people to view them as parts of one larger mystery. The expression Bennington Triangle did not originate during the disappearances themselves, but was introduced decades later by Vermont author and folklorist Joseph A. Citro. Writing about the region's unusual history, Citro drew attention to the concentration of unexplained disappearances and other strange stories connected with the mountains surrounding Glastonbury, borrowing the familiar concept of a triangle to suggest an area marked by recurring mysteries. His work did not claim to solve the disappearances, nor did it establish an official boundary accepted by law enforcement or historians. Instead, it provided a memorable framework that allowed separate historical events to be discussed as parts of a single regional legend, a perspective that would profoundly influence how future generations encountered the story. The impact of that new identity extended well beyond books devoted specifically to Vermont folklore. As interest in unexplained mysteries expanded through documentaries, magazine features, television programs, podcasts, and eventually online communities, the Bennington Triangle became one of several American locations regularly compared with other famous regions associated with disappearances and unexplained events. Each retelling introduced the story to new audiences, many of whom encountered the legend long before they learned the details of the individual investigations. In the process, the disappearances themselves increasingly became remembered as pieces of a broader mystery, with the name of the region often taking precedence over the unique circumstances of each case. Careful historians often reach a different conclusion than popular storytellers, even when they begin with the very same cases. Historical research asks whether dates, locations, witness statements, newspaper reports, and official records support a particular claim, while folklore is often more interested in the themes that connect separate events into a meaningful narrative. Neither approach exists in complete isolation. Folklore frequently grows from genuine historical incidents, while historical investigations must also acknowledge how later interpretations have shaped public understanding. The challenge lies in recognizing where documented evidence ends and where interpretation begins, particularly in cases that have remained unresolved for generations. Rather than revealing a single missing fifth victim, the historical record ultimately shows how uncertainty itself became one of the defining features of the Bennington Triangle. The debate has never been solely about adding another name to a list, or determining the exact number of disappearances that belong within its boundaries. It reflects something more fundamental, the difficulty of drawing clear lines around a mystery that developed gradually through overlapping investigations, incomplete evidence, and decades of retelling. That uncertainty has become part of the legend's endurance, inviting each new generation to revisit the same records, ask the same questions, and occasionally reach different conclusions while examining the very same events. The questions may have grown into legend over time, but they all began with ordinary people stepping into the wilderness in search of someone who never returned. Inside one of Vermont's largest searches, hope accompanied every search party into the mountains, even when experience warned that every passing hour reduced the chances of success. Behind every headline about a disappearance stood dozens and sometimes hundreds of ordinary people who left their homes believing they might be the ones to bring someone back alive. Their work began long before theories of mysterious triangles or unexplained forces entered the public imagination. In those first hours, there was no legend to explain what had happened, only an urgent conviction that the missing person could not have gone very far. Yet again and again, searches that appeared overwhelming in size ended without the answers everyone expected, forcing investigators to confront a difficult reality. Finding a single individual in the mountains of southern Vermont was far more complicated than simply sending more people into the woods. Every operation depended upon one crucial piece of information that was often far less certain than it first appeared. Investigators began by identifying the last confirmed location where the missing person had been seen, then worked outward from that point in the hope that witnesses, physical evidence, or the missing person's known intentions would help define the most likely direction of travel. In theory, this provided a logical starting point. In practice, however, that final confirmed sighting often represented only the last place where someone had definitely been observed, not necessarily the place where they had remained. A person might leave a trail voluntarily, become disoriented, change direction unexpectedly, or encounter circumstances no witness ever observed. Every uncertainty expanded the possible search area, and each additional mile dramatically increased the amount of ground that required attention. Volunteers arrived from surrounding communities with a shared determination that often outpaced the resources available to coordinate them. Local residents familiar with the region joined police officers, game wardens, firefighters, and members of the National Guard during several of the larger operations, creating search parties that reflected an extraordinary willingness to help complete strangers. Family members frequently remained nearby throughout the effort, providing investigators with information about routines, clothing, physical condition, and any detail that might assist in predicting where the missing person could have gone. As more volunteers appeared, however, organising them into effective teams became a significant responsibility in its own right. Search leaders had to decide which areas had already been examined, which still required attention, and how to avoid leaving important gaps while preventing multiple groups from unknowingly covering the same locations. Fresh evidence rarely remained fresh for long once the search began. A footprint impressed into soft ground could lose its definition after changing weather or repeated movement through the area. Broken vegetation that initially suggested recent passage might become impossible to distinguish from older damage after only a short time. Even the recollections of witnesses became more difficult to evaluate as hours turned into days, because memories naturally shifted as people attempted to reconstruct rapidly unfolding events. For investigators, the earlier stages of any search therefore carried exceptional importance. Every delay increased the likelihood that the physical clues capable of narrowing the search area would gradually disappear before they could be documented or properly interpreted. Tracking dogs offered investigators one of their best opportunities to follow a disappearing trail before it vanished altogether. Properly trained scent dogs could detect and follow human odour across considerable distances under favourable conditions, making them an invaluable resource in missing person investigations long before many modern search technologies became available. During several searches associated with the Bennington disappearances, dogs were deployed in an effort to establish the direction in which the missing individual had travelled after their last confirmed sighting. Their work often helped investigators eliminate certain possibilities while directing attention toward others, but even the most experienced handlers understood that a scent trail was never guaranteed to continue uninterrupted. Weather, the passage of time, human activity within the search area, and countless other variables could weaken or scatter scent, making successful tracking increasingly difficult as the hours passed. The behaviour of tracking dogs also required careful interpretation rather than unquestioning acceptance. When a dog appeared to lose a scent or abruptly change direction, investigators could not immediately conclude that the missing person had vanished at that precise location. A disrupted trail might simply reflect changing environmental conditions or the limitations of scent detection, rather than the movements of the individual being sought. Experienced handlers therefore treated canine searches as one important investigative tool among many, comparing the dog's responses with witness statements, known travel routes, and any physical evidence recovered during the operation. Even so, there were occasions when the dog's apparent inability to continue a trail deepened rather than resolved the mystery, leaving searchers with fewer certainties than they had hoped to gain. Aircraft eventually joined several of the larger search efforts, promising a wider view that proved less revealing than many had hoped. Fixed-wing airplanes and in some instances aerial observation were used to expand the search beyond what could reasonably be covered on foot within the available time. From above, investigators hoped to identify obvious signs of movement, abandoned equipment, brightly coloured clothing, or disturbances that might indicate where search teams should concentrate their efforts. The broader perspective offered genuine advantages, allowing large sections of the search area to be examined far more quickly than ground teams could manage alone. Yet aerial observation rarely produced the immediate breakthrough many people imagined. Even with an elevated vantage point, locating a single individual remained an extraordinarily demanding task, particularly when no one knew exactly where to begin looking beyond the last confirmed point of contact. Coordinating large numbers of people across the mountains presented challenges that extended well beyond simply covering more ground. Search leaders had to divide volunteers into manageable teams, assign specific areas, establish meeting points, and ensure that important discoveries could be communicated quickly to everyone involved. During the 1940s and early 1950s, however, search coordinators worked without many of the communication tools that later generations would come to take for granted. Portable radios were far less common than they are today, and reliable communication between widely separated search parties could not always be maintained. In many situations, messages had to be carried from one team to another in person, delaying decisions at precisely the moments when investigators most needed to respond quickly to new information. Maintaining an organised search also required balancing urgency with discipline. It was natural for volunteers, particularly those who knew the missing individual, to want to push farther ahead, or revisit places they believed had been overlooked. Yet effective search operations depended upon careful planning rather than instinct alone. Teams recorded the sections they had already examined, reported anything unusual regardless of how insignificant it appeared, and attempted to eliminate areas systematically rather than relying on chance. The work demanded patience that could be difficult to sustain when every hour seemed to reduce the likelihood of a successful outcome. Searchers understood that missing even a small section of ground could have lasting consequences, but attempting to search too quickly carried the same risk. Hours of searching gradually accumulated into days, bringing physical exhaustion alongside growing uncertainty. Volunteers often walked long distances over uneven ground, repeatedly climbing and descending while carrying equipment and supplies needed for extended operations. Fatigue affected not only the body but also concentration, making it increasingly difficult to notice subtle details after spending entire days scanning the same surroundings. Search leaders therefore faced the additional responsibility of rotating personnel whenever possible, recognizing that fresh eyes sometimes noticed evidence that weary searchers had unknowingly overlooked. Determination remained remarkably strong throughout many of the Bennington searches, yet determination alone could not prevent exhaustion from becoming another obstacle. The emotional burden carried by those involved was no less demanding than the physical one. Families waited for updates that often brought little more than confirmation that another section of the search area had been completed without results. Volunteers who had entered the mountains expecting to help bring someone home instead found themselves confronting repeated disappointment as each day's efforts ended without a breakthrough. Investigators likewise had to balance optimism with realism, encouraging search teams to continue, while privately recognizing that the probability of finding decisive evidence often declined as time passed. Those emotional pressures rarely appeared in newspaper headlines, but they formed an inseparable part of every prolonged search. Success in a search cannot be measured solely by the number of people involved, a reality repeatedly demonstrated during the Bennington investigations. A search involving hundreds of volunteers may appear comprehensive when viewed from a distance, yet experienced investigators have long recognized that complete coverage of every possible location is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Search areas must often be prioritized according to probability, available personnel, daylight, and the information known at the time. As a result, some sections inevitably receive closer attention than others, not because they are considered unimportant, but because practical decisions must be made about where limited resources can be used most effectively. Even the most carefully organised operation therefore reflects a series of informed judgments rather than absolute certainty. Looking back across these operations reveals that the greatest obstacle was not a lack of commitment from those involved, but the immense complexity of the task they had undertaken. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, military personnel, families, and local residents invested extraordinary amounts of time and effort in attempts to locate the missing, often refusing to abandon hope long after the first days of the investigation had passed. Their work demonstrated remarkable cooperation and persistence, yet the limited results underscored a sobering truth shared by missing person investigations everywhere. A determined search does not always produce a determined answer. In the Bennington cases, the absence of clear evidence became as significant as any clue that investigators actually discovered, reinforcing the sense that these disappearances resisted even the most sustained efforts to resolve them. Only by understanding the mountain itself does it become possible to appreciate why so many determined searches ended with so many unanswered questions. A landscape that hides everything. Beyond every search map and witness statement stood the same silent presence that shaped every investigation from beginning to end. Long after search parties returned home and newspaper headlines faded from public attention, Glastonbury Mountain remained exactly where it had always been, indifferent to the questions people continued asking about those who had disappeared within its surroundings. It has often been tempting to think of the mountain merely as the backdrop to the Bennington Triangle, a stage upon which a series of unrelated tragedies happened to unfold. Yet the physical landscape was never simply scenery. Every decision made by investigators, every route chosen by hikers, and every clue that was found, or failed to be found, was influenced by the environment itself. Understanding that landscape does not solve every mystery associated with the Bennington Triangle, but it does explain why certainty proved so difficult to achieve. Rising above the former settlement of Glastonbury, the surrounding wilderness has remained remarkably unchanged despite the passing decades. Located within the Green Mountains of southwestern Vermont, the area is defined by vast stretches of forest, steep slopes, and limited development that leave much of the landscape looking much as it did during the disappearances of the 1940s and 1950s. The town of Glastonbury itself gradually declined after the collapse of its logging and charcoal industries, eventually becoming an unincorporated ghost town with only a handful of residents. As roads disappeared beneath vegetation and former settlements faded back into the forest, the mountain became known less as a place where people lived and more as a place people entered. That transition quietly transformed the region into one of the most isolated areas in southern Vermont, where long distances could separate even familiar landmarks, and where modern visitors can still encounter extended stretches of wilderness with little evidence of permanent human activity. Within only a short distance of the nearest trail, the forest begins to limit what people can actually see. Unlike open landscapes where distant landmarks help maintain orientation, dense woodland reduces visibility to surprisingly short distances, often allowing only fragments of the surrounding terrain to remain in view at any given moment. Tree trunks, thick undergrowth, and uneven vegetation combine to create a constantly shifting series of visual barriers, making it entirely possible for two people separated by a relatively small distance to lose sight of one another almost immediately. Even during daylight hours, the forest canopy filters sunlight unevenly, producing patches of shadow that can make judging distance and direction more difficult than many first-time visitors expect. From within the trees, the mountain rarely reveals its overall shape. Instead, it presents only small pieces of the landscape at a time, encouraging movement based upon what lies immediately ahead rather than what may exist beyond the next rise. Few sections of the mountain allow movement to remain as straightforward as it first appears. Although maps may suggest a gradual climb or a direct route between two locations, the ground itself frequently tells a different story. Rocky outcrops interrupt otherwise manageable slopes, shallow streams force repeated changes in direction, and narrow ravines can require lengthy detours despite appearing insignificant from a distance. Fallen trees, exposed roots, loose stones, and thick patches of vegetation further complicate travel, particularly for anyone attempting to leave an established trail. Small deviations made to avoid one obstacle can gradually carry a person farther away from their intended course without any obvious indication that they have wandered off route. Because these changes often occur one careful decision at a time rather than through a single dramatic mistake, disorientation can develop far more subtly than many people imagine. Conditions in the high country can transform with surprising speed as the weather begins to change. Clear skies in the morning do not always guarantee stable conditions throughout the day, particularly during autumn, when many of the Bennington disappearances occurred. Rain can make exposed rock and fallen leaves unexpectedly slippery, while low clouds and fog may reduce visibility even further by obscuring features that moments earlier had served as useful points of reference. Cooler temperatures at higher elevations can also create conditions noticeably different from those experienced in nearby towns, reminding visitors that mountain environments often follow their own rhythms, rather than those of the surrounding valleys. None of these changes are extraordinary in themselves. They are familiar characteristics of mountain weather throughout New England. Yet when combined with isolation and uncertain terrain, ordinary weather has the potential to complicate even the simplest journey through the forest. Even experienced hikers can discover how quickly confidence gives way to uncertainty once familiar points of reference disappear. Wilderness navigation depends upon maintaining a continuous awareness of direction, but dense forests can interrupt that awareness in subtle ways. A person may believe they are walking in a straight line while gradually drifting off course, especially after repeatedly adjusting their path to avoid natural obstacles. Without prominent landmarks visible through the trees, distinguishing one section of woodland from another becomes increasingly difficult, as similar slopes, rock formations, and clusters of trees begin to resemble one another. Modern hikers often rely upon satellite navigation to compensate for those challenges, but during the mid-20th century, navigation depended far more heavily upon maps, compasses, personal experience, and visual recognition of the landscape. Even skilled outdoorsmen understood that remaining oriented demanded constant attention rather than assumption. Evidence left behind in the wilderness rarely remains untouched for very long. A footprint impressed into damp earth may gradually soften until it becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding ground, while fallen leaves carried by the wind can cover signs of recent movement within hours. Flowing water is capable of washing away tracks near stream crossings, and new plant growth steadily alters the appearance of places that initially seemed easy to recognize. Seasonal changes contribute even further to this transformation. The colourful forests of autumn eventually give way to snow, only to emerge again beneath fresh spring vegetation, creating a landscape that never remains exactly the same for long. Time itself, therefore, becomes one of the mountain's most effective disguises, quietly erasing the physical traces that investigators depend upon to reconstruct events. Distance is not always experienced the way maps suggest when forests, valleys, and shifting winds intervene. Voices can seem unexpectedly close, one moment, before fading almost completely the next, while echoes and changes in elevation may make it difficult to determine where a sound actually originated. A person calling for help might reasonably believe their voice is carrying across the mountains, even though dense vegetation and uneven terrain can significantly reduce how far those calls travel or alter the direction from which they appear to come. At the same time, natural sounds produced by moving water, wind passing through the trees, or wildlife can blend together in ways that make the wilderness feel simultaneously alive and strangely empty. These are ordinary characteristics of mountainous environments, yet they illustrate how easily human perception can become unreliable when familiar points of reference begin to disappear. The mountain's natural features also help explain why seemingly simple journeys can become unexpectedly complicated. A route that appears direct on paper may require constant adjustments once encountered in person, with each detour introducing opportunities for confusion that accumulate almost unnoticed. Returning by the same path is not always as straightforward as retracing one's footsteps, particularly after changing weather, fading daylight, or an altered perspective makes familiar landmarks appear unfamiliar. Many experienced search and rescue organizations emphasize that people who become disoriented often remain far closer to established routes than they realize, hidden not by extraordinary distances but by ordinary terrain that conceals them from view. That understanding does not account for every aspect of the Bennington disappearances, but it does demonstrate that wilderness can produce situations that seem astonishing when viewed only from the outside. Taken together, these ordinary features of the mountain begin to explain why extraordinary mysteries can emerge from entirely natural circumstances. Isolation, limited visibility, Uneven ground, changing weather, and the gradual disappearance of physical evidence create conditions in which uncertainty can persist long after an event has occurred. None of these characteristics require supernatural explanations, nor are they unique to Glastonbury Mountain alone. Similar environments throughout the world have challenged hikers, investigators, and search teams for generations. What distinguishes Glastonbury is not that it possesses impossible qualities, but that several widely remembered disappearances occurred within a landscape already capable of frustrating even the most determined efforts to establish exactly what had happened. Yet the landscape, for all that it can explain, has never managed to answer every question left behind by the Bennington disappearances. Natural hazards offer plausible explanations for many of the practical difficulties faced by those who vanished and by the people searching for them, but they cannot fully reconstruct the final decisions, unexpected encounters, or individual circumstances that disappeared with each missing person. The historical record remains incomplete, leaving gaps that geography alone cannot fill. It is within those gaps that the enduring fascination with the Bennington Triangle has survived, balanced between the realities of a demanding wilderness and the unanswered questions that continue to invite investigation decades later. When the known explanations reached their limits, the stories waiting beyond them began to take on lives of their own. The stories that grew in the shadows. Uncertainty has a remarkable way of inviting explanations that facts alone cannot always provide. When investigations reach the limits of available evidence, people rarely stop asking questions simply because no official answer exists. Instead, they search elsewhere, drawing upon local traditions, personal experiences, and stories shared by neighbours until the unknown begins to take on a life of its own. The Bennington Triangle followed that familiar path. The disappearances were real, the searches were documented, and the landscape presented genuine challenges, yet none of those facts completely satisfied public curiosity. As the years passed, the unanswered questions surrounding Glastonbury Mountain gradually became surrounded by a second history, one built not from police reports or newspaper records alone, but from the folklore that flourishes wherever certainty proves difficult to preserve. Gradually, the disappearances became only one part of a much broader collection of stories surrounding the mountain. Visitors who had never known the missing individuals began sharing accounts of unusual experiences they believed had taken place within the same forests, while older local traditions were revisited through the lens of the Bennington mysteries. Experiences that might once have remained isolated anecdotes increasingly became connected because they occurred in roughly the same area. This process is not unique to Vermont. Throughout history, locations associated with unexplained events have often accumulated additional stories, as each generation interpreted the past according to its own beliefs and cultural influences. The Bennington Triangle eventually became one of those places where historical events and evolving folklore existed side by side, each influencing how the other was remembered. Reports of a large, unidentified creature eventually found their place among the many claims associated with the region. Although the original disappearances from the 1940s and 1950s contain no documented references to such a creature, later accounts from hikers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts occasionally described encounters with something unusually large moving through the forests of southern Vermont. These reports became associated with the broader tradition of Bigfoot sightings that had already emerged across North America, where descriptions often centered on a tall, human-like figure covered in dark hair and observed only briefly before disappearing into dense woodland. No physical evidence has ever verified the existence of such a creature in the Bennington area, and investigators have never connected these claims to the historical disappearances themselves. Nevertheless, the mountain's isolation and extensive forests provided an environment in which such reports naturally attracted attention, allowing them to become woven into the growing mythology surrounding the region. Nightfall introduced another kind of mystery that witnesses struggled to describe with certainty. Over the years, some visitors reported seeing unusual lights moving among distant ridgelines or appearing unexpectedly through the trees, before fading from view without any obvious source. Such accounts varied considerably in their details, making them difficult to compare or investigate systematically. Some observers believed they had witnessed something genuinely unexplained, while others suggested that atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, aircraft, reflections, or other natural phenomena could account for many of the sightings. Similar reports of unexplained lights exist in wilderness regions around the world, and the Bennington Triangle is no exception. What made these stories endure was not that they could be conclusively verified, but that they occurred within a landscape already associated with unanswered disappearances, encouraging many listeners to interpret ordinary uncertainty as part of a larger mystery. Not every unexplained encounter involved something that could actually be seen. A number of visitors instead described hearing unusual sounds that seemed strangely difficult to identify or locate. Some spoke of distant voices carrying unexpectedly through the trees, while others recalled isolated whistles, unexplained knocking sounds, or footsteps that appeared to stop as suddenly as they had begun. Wilderness environments are capable of producing remarkably deceptive acoustics, with wind, uneven terrain, moving water, wildlife, and echoes sometimes altering how sounds are perceived. Even so, experiences that resist immediate explanation often leave a lasting impression, particularly when they occur in places already surrounded by unsettling stories. For many people, the uncertainty created by those moments became more memorable than any ordinary explanation that might later be offered. Modern interpretations gradually carried the Bennington Triangle into ideas that never appeared in the earliest historical accounts. Claims involving hidden portals, dimensional gateways, mysterious energy fields, and alleged time slips are now frequently discussed in online forums, paranormal investigations, and speculative media. Yet these concepts do not appear in the contemporary records documenting the disappearances themselves. They represent a much later layer of interpretation that developed as the legend expanded and became connected with broader themes found throughout modern paranormal culture. Similar ideas have been attached to numerous locations around the world, particularly places already regarded as mysterious because of disappearances or unexplained events. While such theories remain popular among some enthusiasts, historians generally distinguish them from the documented history of the Bennington Triangle, recognizing that they reflect changing cultural interests rather than evidence preserved from the original investigations. Centuries of regional folklore had already given Vermont's forests a reputation for strange tales before the Bennington disappearances were ever connected. Long before the modern term Bennington Triangle entered public discussion, rural communities in New England carried stories of haunted woods, unexplained travelers, and places in the wilderness where ordinary expectations seemed to falter. These accounts were not tied to any single investigation or documented event, but instead reflected a broader tradition in which dense forests and isolated terrain naturally became settings for uncertainty. When later disappearances occurred in the same general region, it was perhaps inevitable that older storytelling traditions would be revisited and reinterpreted through a contemporary lens, merging historical memory with modern mystery in ways that are difficult to fully separate. Communities confronted with enduring mysteries have often created stories that reach beyond what surviving evidence can explain. In the case of the Bennington Triangle, this process unfolded gradually, rather than through any single moment of transformation. Each unresolved disappearance added another layer of ambiguity, and with each passing year, the absence of definitive answers allowed interpretation to expand in multiple directions. People tend to organize uncertainty into patterns, and when information is incomplete, imagination often steps in to fill the gaps. The result is not necessarily deliberate exaggeration, but a natural tendency to seek meaning in events that resist straightforward explanation, especially when those events occur in places already associated with isolation and difficulty. Maintaining a distinction between established history and accumulated folklore remains one of the greatest challenges in studying the Bennington Triangle today. The documented disappearances of individuals such as James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer are grounded in historical records, witness statements, and investigative efforts from their respective periods. These cases form the factual foundation upon which later interpretations were built. However, as time passed, additional narratives began to circulate alongside those records, sometimes blending verified details with speculation in ways that make it difficult for modern audiences to separate what was originally observed from what was later imagined. This overlap does not diminish the historical significance of the disappearances themselves, but it does highlight how easily public memory can evolve when direct answers remain incomplete. Far beyond the forests where the disappearances occurred, the stories eventually began a journey of their own. What began as regional accounts shared among local communities gradually expanded outward, carried by writers, researchers, and enthusiasts who found in the Bennington Triangle a compelling example of an enduring unsolved mystery. As these stories spread, they were retold in different forms, each version emphasizing certain elements while downplaying others, further contributing to the fluid nature of the legend. In this way, the Bennington Triangle became not only a reference to a specific geographic region in Vermont, but also a narrative framework through which broader questions about disappearance, uncertainty, and the unknown could be explored. It would not be long before those stories reached audiences far beyond the mountains where they first took root. The Bennington Triangle in popular culture. When accounts of the Bennington disappearances began moving beyond Vermont, their meaning started shifting in subtle but significant ways. What had once been a series of isolated historical records tied to specific individuals and specific moments in time gradually entered a broader public space where context was no longer fixed by geography or first-hand testimony. Each retelling carried the same core events outward from the Green Mountains, but in doing so, it also placed them into new frameworks shaped by audience expectation, narrative structure, and the practical needs of communication across different media. The result was not an immediate transformation, but a slow accumulation of reinterpretations that altered how the events were understood without necessarily changing the underlying historical record itself. Early printed compilations and regional histories played a key role in grouping the separate incidents under a single recognizable label. In these accounts, the disappearances were often presented together for clarity, even when the original investigations had occurred in different years and under different circumstances. The act of grouping them did not create the events themselves, but it did change how they were perceived by readers encountering them for the first time. Once placed within a shared framework, the individual cases began to be viewed not only as separate tragedies, but also as part of a collective pattern associated with a specific region of Vermont. This interpretive shift marked one of the earliest stages in the formation of what would eventually become known as the Bennington Triangle, where organizational decisions in writing helped establish conceptual connections that were not always present in the original documentation. Television documentaries approaching the subject decades later often organize the events into structured narratives designed for broader audiences. Unlike written compilations that relied on sequential presentation, televised formats tended to emphasize pacing, visual reconstruction, and thematic continuity. This often meant that complex investigative details were condensed into clearer narrative arcs that could be followed within a limited runtime. While these adaptations made the material more accessible, they also introduced a degree of simplification that inevitably affected how the cases were perceived. Distinctions between separate disappearances sometimes became less pronounced, and contextual nuances could be reduced in favor of a more unified storyline that emphasized mystery and unresolved questions. Podcast storytelling introduced a format where the Bennington Triangle could be revisited repeatedly across episodic analysis and speculation. The serialized nature of audio programs allowed creators to explore different aspects of the cases over extended periods, often returning to earlier points with additional commentary or alternative interpretations. This structure encouraged deeper engagement with the material, as listeners followed developments across multiple installments rather than a single presentation. At the same time, the conversational tone common in podcast formats sometimes blurred the boundary between established fact and speculative discussion, particularly when hosts examined theories alongside documented evidence without always maintaining strict separation between the two. Digital communities on discussion forums and social platforms expanded the scope of interpretation far beyond traditional media boundaries. In these spaces, individuals from different regions and backgrounds could share observations, theories, and questions almost instantaneously, creating an environment where the Bennington Triangle became a recurring topic of collective analysis. Information circulated rapidly, often stripped of its original context as it was reposted, summarized, or reinterpreted by different users. This environment allowed new ideas to emerge quickly, but it also increased the likelihood that subtle inaccuracies or speculative additions would become embedded within ongoing discussions simply through repetition. Over time, these exchanges contributed to a version of the narrative that was shaped as much by dialogue and engagement as by historical record. Repetition across multiple formats gradually reshaped how specific details were remembered or emphasized in public discussions. Certain elements of the original disappearances became more prominent simply because they were more frequently referenced, while other details received less attention and slowly receded from collective memory. this process did not require intentional distortion. It emerged naturally from the way information is selected, summarized, and retold across different platforms. As a result, the Bennington Triangle evolved into a narrative that contained both stable historical anchors and fluid interpretive layers, making it increasingly difficult for audiences encountering the story to distinguish between original documentation and later emphasis. Audience interest in unresolved cases has historically influenced how such stories are selected, framed, and sustained over time. Unanswered questions tend to hold a particular appeal because they invite continued engagement, allowing each generation to approach the material with new perspectives and interpretive frameworks. In the case of the Bennington Triangle, this interest ensured that the disappearances remained part of public discourse long after the original investigations had concluded. However, sustained attention also meant that the story was repeatedly revisited under changing cultural conditions, each of which influenced how it was presented and understood. The combination of enduring curiosity and evolving storytelling practices contributed to the gradual expansion of the narrative beyond its original historical boundaries. In cultural terms, the Bennington Triangle increasingly functioned as a narrative structure that could be applied to similar unexplained cases elsewhere. Rather than referring solely to a specific region or set of events, the term began to represent a broader category of mystery involving disappearances in wilderness settings. This conceptual flexibility allowed it to be used as a reference point in discussions of other cases that shared thematic similarities, even when no direct historical connection existed. As a result, the Bennington Triangle became less a fixed historical label and more a symbolic framework through which certain types of unexplained events could be interpreted and compared. Careful review of historical records remains essential when distinguishing original investigative findings from later interpretive additions. The documented disappearances of individuals such as James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer are grounded in specific reports, witness accounts, and investigative efforts from their respective periods, each reflecting the circumstances and limitations of the time in which they occurred. These records form the foundation upon which all subsequent interpretations have been built, providing a necessary point of reference when evaluating later claims or retellings. Without this grounding in original documentation, it becomes increasingly difficult to assess how and when additional layers of interpretation were introduced into the broader narrative. Separated from its geographic origins, the story continued circulating as an adaptable framework rather than a fixed account. In this form, the Bennington Triangle no longer depended solely on direct references to Vermont or to the specific disappearances that first brought attention to the region. Instead, it operated as a flexible narrative construct capable of accommodating new interpretations, retellings, and associations. This adaptability allowed the story to persist across different contexts and media formats, even as its connection to the original events became more abstract over time. From that point onward, the Bennington Triangle existed as much in retelling as it did in the mountains where it first began. What the investigations actually revealed. Once removed from cultural retellings, the Bennington Triangle is reduced to a series of investigative files that share far less coherence than later interpretations suggest. What appears in retrospect to be a single unified mystery was, in its original form, a collection of separate cases recorded across different years, under different circumstances, and by different agencies operating within the limitations of their time. When these records are examined without the narrative framework built around them later, what remains is not a singular pattern waiting to be solved, but a set of incomplete accounts that resist easy alignment with one another. The impression of connection emerges primarily from proximity and geography, and later historical grouping rather than from any documented decision by early investigators to treat the disappearances as a single phenomenon. Archival records show that each disappearance was documented according to the standards and limitations of its respective time period. Reporting practices in the mid-20th century varied significantly depending on jurisdiction, available manpower, and the urgency assigned to missing person cases at the time of filing. Some reports contain detailed descriptions of last known movements and witness statements, while others are brief summaries compiled after initial search efforts failed to produce immediate results. In several instances, records were updated over time as new information emerged, but the structure of documentation rarely remained consistent from one case to another. This unevenness does not indicate negligence. but rather reflects the evolving nature of investigative procedures during a period when standardized national protocols for missing persons were still developing. Statements collected from witnesses remain among the most valuable yet most variable components of the surviving case material. In many investigations, eyewitness accounts provided the first and sometimes only direct insight into the final confirmed moments before a disappearance was reported. However, these accounts were often recorded under conditions of stress, uncertainty, or delayed recollection, all of which are known factors that can influence memory accuracy without implying intentional distortion. Over time, differences in phrasing, timing, and perceived sequence of events naturally appeared across multiple statements, even when describing the same general incident. Investigators were therefore required to weigh consistency against plausibility, often without the benefit of independent physical confirmation for each detail provided. Physical traces associated with the cases were rarely sufficient on their own to establish a continuous and verifiable sequence of events. In wilderness environments, especially those subject to seasonal change, any potential evidence can be altered, obscured, or removed by natural processes within relatively short periods. This makes it difficult to distinguish between the absence of evidence and the loss of evidence over time. In several of the Bennington area disappearances, investigators noted the lack of conclusive physical indicators that could definitively reconstruct the final movements of the individuals involved. While such absences do not exclude specific explanations, they also do not provide enough material to confirm any single scenario with certainty. Operational documentation from search efforts provides insight into investigative scope, though it does not always clarify final outcomes. Records indicate that searches were conducted using the methods available at the time, including ground teams, coordinated volunteer participation, and, where possible, aerial observation. These efforts were often extensive relative to regional capacity, and reflected a genuine commitment to locating missing individuals. However, the effectiveness of such operations was inherently limited by terrain, weather conditions, and communication constraints that affected coordination in real time. The documentation that survives these efforts illustrates both the scale of response and the practical barriers that prevented complete coverage of all potential areas of interest. Conclusions reached by investigators generally remained within frameworks consistent with known environmental, behavioural, and accidental factors. These included possibilities such as disorientation in unfamiliar terrain, accidental injury, exposure to harsh weather conditions, and other scenarios commonly associated with missing person cases in wilderness regions. In each individual case, investigators evaluated available evidence against these possibilities, though the degree of certainty varied depending on the amount of information recovered. Importantly, no single official conclusion emerged that was applied uniformly across all cases in the region, reinforcing the fact that each disappearance retained its own investigative boundaries rather than merging into a single resolved explanation. Cross-case evaluation occasionally attempted to identify recurring elements across multiple disappearances within the same geographic region. These efforts were largely retrospective, occurring after the accumulation of several separate cases had already drawn public attention. Analysts and researchers examining the records noted that while similarities existed in terms of location and environmental conditions, the specific circumstances surrounding each disappearance differed in significant ways. Time of day, companionship status, intended travel routes, and reported last sightings did not consistently align across cases, making it difficult to construct a unified model that accounted for all variables simultaneously. As a result, any perceived pattern remained interpretive rather than demonstrably causal. Separating unrelated incidents across different years and circumstances proved to be one of the central difficulties in forming any unified assessment. The passage of time between cases meant that investigative personnel, methods, and available technologies changed from one incident to the next. This introduced variations not only in the quality of documentation, but also in the types of questions that could reasonably be answered at the time. When later attempts were made to review the cases collectively, these inconsistencies became more apparent, highlighting the challenge of applying a single analytical framework to events that were never originally examined as part of a coordinated series. No explanatory model developed to date successfully accounts for every documented disappearance without leaving unresolved gaps in at least one case. This does not imply that individual cases lack plausible explanations, but rather that no single interpretation has been able to accommodate all recorded details simultaneously without contradiction or omission. Some explanations align closely with certain incidents while failing to account for others, while alternative interpretations may address different aspects but introduce new inconsistencies elsewhere in the record. The result is not a failure of investigation, but a reflection of the inherent limitations involved in reconstructing events from incomplete historical and environmental data. Ultimately, the investigative record defines a boundary between what can be established with evidence and what remains beyond its reach. Within that boundary lies a structured account of documented disappearances, recorded observations, and formal investigative responses that together form the most reliable historical foundation available. Outside it are the gaps created by missing information, environmental loss, and the natural limits of retrospective reconstruction. The existence of that boundary does not diminish the seriousness of the cases, but it does clarify the point at which analysis must acknowledge the absence of further verifiable detail. What remains outside that boundary continues to resist any conclusion drawn from the historical record. A place that still refuses to explain itself. Having reached the end of the documented investigations, the narrative naturally shifts back toward the physical ground where every account ultimately converges. The records, testimonies, search reports, and later interpretations all point back to the same geography in southern Vermont. Yet none of them fully exhaust what that geography represents when experienced directly. What remains is not a continuation of unresolved cases, but a return to the place itself, where the historical material and the present landscape exist side by side without merging into a single, complete explanation. Hiking activity in the region continues today, with visitors encountering the same rugged terrain that has defined the area for generations rather than any version of its reputation. The forests of Glastonbury Mountain remain dense and uneven, shaped by elevation, seasonal weather, and long periods of limited development. For those who enter the area on foot, the experience is defined less by narrative expectation and more by physical conditions that demand attention at every step. Trails, where they exist, are often subtle and irregular, and the surrounding woodland quickly reasserts itself in ways that make orientation dependent on careful observation, rather than memory or assumption. Historical interest has led certain visitors to trace documented routes associated with past disappearances, using surviving records as reference points across changing conditions. These efforts are not attempts to recreate events, but rather to understand how terrain, distance, and visibility may have influenced what was recorded at the time. Maps, witness statements, and investigative notes become interpretive tools when placed against the physical environment, revealing how even precise descriptions can become difficult to translate fully into present-day observation. The landscape itself has not remained static across time, yet its core features remain sufficiently consistent to allow comparison between record and reality. Research-oriented perspectives approach the area differently, focusing on separating environmental characteristics from the interpretive layers added in later retellings. In this context, attention is directed toward measurable features such as elevation changes, forest density, water sources, and seasonal accessibility rather than narrative associations. This approach treats the region as a case study in environmental conditions that can complicate navigation, communication, and movement, particularly under variable weather. By isolating physical factors, researchers attempt to identify what aspects of reported events may be explained through terrain alone, without extending conclusions beyond what available evidence supports. Paranormal interpretations persist in parallel discussions, though they remain distinct from the verifiable findings contained within official investigative records. These interpretations are often rooted in later cultural frameworks rather than original documentation, reflecting broader patterns seen in other regions where unresolved events attract symbolic meaning. While such perspectives are widely circulated in popular discourse, they exist outside the scope of conclusions reached through formal investigation. Their persistence illustrates how unresolved history can develop additional interpretive layers over time, even when those layers are not supported by primary evidence. Across all perspectives, one consistent experience emerges from time spent in the region. The terrain itself remains constant while its meaning shifts, depending on who is observing it. This does not alter the documented facts of the disappearances, nor does it resolve the questions that remain within the investigative record. Instead, it highlights the separation between physical environment and interpretive framework, where the same landscape can be understood through multiple non-identical lenses without any single interpretation fully overriding the others. The region thus becomes a point of convergence where different forms of understanding overlap without fully aligning. On-site comparisons between written records and physical locations often reveal how distance between documentation and landscape can alter perception of the same events. Descriptions that appear clear and precise in written form can take on additional complexity when placed against uneven terrain, shifting light conditions, and natural obstructions that affect visibility. This does not invalidate the original records, but it demonstrates how certain details may be more difficult to evaluate outside the context in which they were first recorded. The act of moving between text and terrain introduces a form of interpretive tension that cannot be fully resolved by either source alone. No single interpretive framework has been able to account for every documented case without leaving portions of at least one record outside its explanatory scope. This remains true even when focusing strictly on established evidence, rather than later additions or speculative narratives. Some cases align more closely with certain environmental or situational explanations, while others resist full alignment with the same frameworks. The inconsistency does not point toward a hidden structure, but rather toward the limitations inherent in reconstructing events from incomplete and temporally separated records. Decades of continued attention have ensured that the region remains part of ongoing discussion, even as new information has not fundamentally resolved earlier uncertainties. The persistence of interest reflects not only the original disappearances, but also the broader challenge of interpreting historical events that were never fully documented in real time under controlled conditions. As a result, the Bennington Triangle remains present in both historical study and public imagination, sustained by the tension between what is known and what cannot be fully reconstructed from surviving material. The Bennington Triangle ultimately persists as a convergence point, where recorded history and unresolved interpretation continue to overlap without fully merging. It exists within a space defined equally by documented investigation and the limits of what those investigations could establish at the time. This duality does not produce a single conclusion, but it does define the structure through which the region continues to be understood. And even now, the Bennington Triangle continues to hold that separation in place without offering a final resolution.